Hey, Duvid here. We are live. I'm going to continue on my multiple truth hypothesis theorizing, largely through reading a few more important scientific papers. Eventually, I'll develop like PowerPoints and a presentation and hopefully my own book. But for reasons I've mentioned many times, I want to go over the current state of knowledge. And to do that, I'm largely just going to speak in the words of the experts on the current state. So I actually ordered one of Fernand Gobet's books. I've been mentioning him a few times. Chess Players Studies, Expert on Expertise, Understanding Expertise, a Multidisciplinary Approach. This is a more recent book, I think 2016 even. So this man's a master chess player, psychologist, researcher into the nature of expertise. And I'm probably going to do a whole video just related to Gobet and his studies. So look forward to that coming. I'm going to read today parts of the original paper of AlphaZero. So the main paper in 2017, when it came out and did its big accomplishments, I think beating Go was more impressive than its chess accomplishments. Like I knew about it as a chess player, and here's its book on chess, and even has strategies related to what the best players at chess interpreted were the methods that it was using. So I mean, chess, you could see an end result, one side wins or not. But in terms of what strategy did it employ, you can't really know. And me and Jennifer were talking about that in Week in Review in terms of these policies. So, what is a neural network? What does the computer see that we don't see? If AlphaFold figured out how to predict the 3D model of protein folding, how did the computer go about doing it? And saying, we don't really know. We just know the algorithm. So last time Jennifer came on, we went through PowerPoints of some of those algorithms. Today I'm going to read some of the papers, and then I'm also going to look at a few papers on the most recent knowledge of the connection of artificial intelligence and neuroscience, the part of the brains, how that works. And I'm going to go on to this concept of expertise. How do you become an expert at something? And there's a concept of mental labor. What does it mean to do mental labor? What does it mean to become better, to exert effort? In Hebrew, they call it hishtadlus. So let me enter screen share here. So I ordered a few books related to it. I didn't order all this Frontiers of the Cognitive Psychology series. I just ordered the one that was cheap. Sorry, I'm kind of cheap. Motivation and Cognitive Control. But there's 9 series from chess players. This man, Anders Ericsson, he's like, I guess, the biggest expert on the 10,000 hour rule for expertise. So I ordered some of his works, Illustrated Edition, Development of Professional Expertise Towards Measurement of Expert Performance and Design of Optimal Learning Environments. Just look at the description here. Professionals such as medical doctors, airplane pilots, lawyers, and technical specialists find that some of their peers have reached high levels of achievement that are difficult to measure objectively. In order to understand in what extent is it possible to learn from these expert performers for the purpose of helping others improve their performance, we first need to reproduce and measure their performance. This book is designed to provide the first comprehensive overview of research on the acquisition and training of professional performance as measured by objective methods rather than subjective ratings by supervisors. In this collection of articles, the world's foremost experts discuss methods of assessing the expert's knowledge and review our knowledge on how we can measure professional performance and design training environments that permit beginning and experienced professionals to develop and maintain their high levels of performance, using examples from a wide range of professional domains. And I also Just saw this book also by Anders, Peak Secret of a New Science of Expertise, 2017. So this is recent, and this also chess. You talk about adaptability, mental representation. I'm going to read a paper about that right now. So hopefully these books will come in soon. Here's the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance, edited by Anders Ericsson. So order these books. This one's a big one, I think like 900 pages. So I'll hopefully try to pound through this. And see, so it's actually a cutting field of expertise, and it's important to everybody. Like, what does expertise mean? How do you become an expert at something? And it's related to chess because I'm a chess player. I was familiar with some of this stuff. My father, because I trained at chess and I trained chess players. And you want to know how do you become expert? And I'll show you why chess is actually one of the main fields related to this, as I've already demonstrated in other articles. So what I want to do today, I want to look at a few articles. I had pulled out 5. I'm going to do all 5. I'm definitely going to probably start with this one, the Mastering Chess and Shogi by Self-Play with a General Reinforcement Learning Algorithm. And this was the main first paper in 2017 on AlphaZero. So I'll read through quite a bit of that, and that has at the end even some key terms, I think, that maybe I'll read through that might be useful to understanding. And sorry about the slowness. I'm trying to prepare myself to be able to speak for a few hours straight intelligently. And as I mentioned, the method, just to help myself, training my own mind to chunk this information. So this is an exercise that Duvid is performing live in chunking theory by reading these papers, that it's going to chunk this information in my mind, whatever my own understanding of it, but I'm going to put the words of the current experts into my mind through saying it out loud, and watch that back, and as a memory technique. So now I will be able to express my ideas in a similar language to the current experts of the field. So this is also a DeepMind related paper. What is a cognitive map? Organizing knowledge for flexible behavior. Got a lot of nice diagrams, and this will show you the most current information on cognitive science and these conceptions of how the brain performs thought related to neuroscience evidence. I also want to read mental labor, also related through DeepMind. You see Matthew Batvinik, I think related to famous chess player. Interesting paper here on what is this mental labor that causes a person to get better. We talk like chess performance, and people plateau and stop getting better. And there's a certain thing that refer to active work or study that changes the mind, that chunks. You're saying you only make new chunks when it's a mental labor. If it's not a mental labor, there's no new chunks formed. We'll see a little bit of the most recent scientific evidence. I've been meaning to read this article actually from a Finnish professor, Chess and Content-Oriented Psychology of Thinking. It's almost 20 years old, but pretty topical, nice summation from a chess perspective of this information. May or may not get to it today. You see all these papers are long. I'd read a similar paper, but just to show the domains of what's been tested, what is known. I'm probably I'll just read the first 3 papers, but we'll see how it goes. I pulled this one out. Also, individual differences in chess expertise, a psychometric investigation to show what is the difference between chess players and what can we actually know from available testing and data. And then we also see like the importance of statistical methods, that at the end of the day, really the best we could do is statistical methods. So say, what is the evidence? The evidence is Paul saying he's watching me. Thanks. So hopefully this is pretty useful. Like, people listen to me talk about Judaism or debate, but then this is really quite essential, useful information. So with that, I'm going to start reading these papers, a little bit of explanation. I hope this is useful to people besides me, but even just as a personal effort on my own to improve my own mind, understand these concepts, to chunk this, to move forward in the advancement of the multiple truth hypothesis. Even if nobody watched this besides myself and I just watched it back. And I told chess players and also streamers, even if you're embarrassed to put yourself out there, you could just record yourself and listen to yourself back. It's like acting lessons or any of these things. So, if Jennifer's capable of listening in, hopefully, or wants to join in at some time, there's going to be a lot of mathematics, and I'm going to go over the history of these machine learning algorithms, but it's mostly going to be me reading. But if Jennifer wants to hop in between papers to add some insight, definitely be appreciated. Either that, it could be, we'll just talk about it a different time. And, I'm going to advance in my research. She'll advance in her research, and, we'll continue to share on week in review. So let me make a blessing, pour coffee. Okay, so I'm going to check my sound one last time. Sounds good. Okay, so let's start with this first paper. And this is Mastering Chess and Shogi by Self-Play with General Reinforcement Learning Algorithm. A lot of authors. This is the main DeepMind, IBM-funded, Google-funded project that first started making big waves in 2017. Maybe like chess players, computer geeks probably knew about this, and we'll see it has a little bit of the history of these computers, and show why I knew about this stuff as a chess player. The game of chess is the most widely studied domain in the history of artificial intelligence. The strongest programs are based on a combination of sophisticated search techniques, domain-specific adaptations, and handcrafted evaluation functions that have been refined by human experts over several decades. In contrast, the AlphaZero program recently achieved superhuman performance in the game of Go by tabula rasa reinforcement learning from games of self-play. In this paper, we generalize this approach into a single AlphaZero algorithm that can achieve tabula rasa superhuman performance in many challenging domains. Starting from random play and given no domain knowledge except the game rules, AlphaZero achieved within 24 hours a superhuman level of play in the game of chess and shogi, as well as Go, and convincingly defeated a world champion program in each case. Study of computer chess is as old as computer science itself. Babbage, Turing, Shannon, Van Neumann devised hardware algorithms and theory to analyze and play the game of chess. Chess subsequently became the grand challenge task for a generation of artificial intelligence researchers, culminating in the high-performance computer chess programs that perform at superhuman level. However, these systems are highly tuned to their domain and cannot be generalized to other problems without significant human effort. A long-standing ambition of artificial intelligence has been to create programs that can instead learn for themselves from first principles. Recently, the AlphaZero algorithm achieved superhuman performance in the game of Go by representing Go knowledge using deep convolutional neural networks, trained solely by reinforcement learning from games of self-play. In this paper, we apply a similar but fully generic algorithm, which we call AlphaZero, to the games of chess and shogi as well as Go, without any additional domain knowledge game, demonstrating that a general-purpose reinforcement learning algorithm can achieve tabula rasa superhuman performance across many challenging domains. The landmark for artificial intelligence was achieved in 1997 when Deep Blue defeated the human world champion. Computer chess programs continue to progress steadily beyond human level in the following 2 decades. These programs evaluate positions using features handcrafted by human grandmasters and carefully tuned weights, combined with high-performance alpha-beta search that expands a vast search tree using a large number of clever heuristics and domain-specific adaptations. In the methods, we describe these augmentations focusing on the 2016 Top Engine Championship, World Champion Stockfish, and other chess programs, including Deep Blue, use very similar architectures. Shogi is a significantly harder game in terms of computational complexity than chess. It's played on a larger board, and any captured opponent piece changes sides and may subsequently be dropped anywhere on the board. The strongest shogi programs, such as Computer Shogi Association, World Champion Elmo, have only recently defeated human champions. These programs use a similar algorithm to computer chess programs, again based on a highly optimized alpha-beta search engine with many domain-specific adaptations. Go is well suited to the neural network architecture used in AlphaGo because the rules of the game are translationally invariant, matching the weight sharing and structure of convolutional networks, are defined in terms of libraries corresponding to the adjacencies between points on the board, matching the local structure of convolutional networks, and are rotationally and reflectionally symmetric, allowing for data augmentation and ensembling. Furthermore, the action space is simple. A stone may be placed at each possible location, and the game outcomes are restricted to binary wins or losses, both of which may help neural network training. Chess and Shogi are arguably less innately suited to AlphaGo's chess neural network architecture. The rules are position dependent. Pawns may move 2 steps forward from the second rank and promote on the 8th rank, and asymmetric, like pawns only move forward, and castling is different on the king side and queen side. The rules include long-range interactions. Queen may traverse the board in one move or checkmate the king from far side of the board. The action space for chess includes all legal destinations for all the players' pieces on the board. Shogi also allows captured pieces to be placed back on the board. Both chess and shogi may result in draws in addition to wins and losses. Indeed, it is believed that the optimal solution to chess is a draw. The AlphaZero algorithm is a more generic version of the AlphaGo Zero algorithm that was first introduced in the context of Go. It replaces the handcrafted knowledge and domain-specific augmentations used in traditional game-playing programs with deep neural networks and a tabula rasa reinforcement learning algorithm. Instead of the handcrafted evaluation function in move ordering heuristics, AlphaZero utilizes a deep neural network, P comma V equals F sub theta of S, with parameters theta. This neural network takes the board position S as an input and outputs a vector of move probability P with components P sub A equals the probability of A and S for each action A and a scalar value V, estimating the expected outcome Z from position S. See the equation. AlphaZero learns these move probabilities and values estimates entirely from self-play. These are then used to guide its search. Instead of alpha-beta search with domain-specific enhancements, alpha-beta uses a general-purpose Monte Carlo tree search algorithm. Each search consists of a series of simulated games and self-play that traverse from a tree from root S root to leaf. Each simulation proceeds by selecting in each state S a move A with a low visit count, high move probability, and high value, averaged over the leaf states of simulations that selected A from S, according to the current neural network F sub 0. The search returns a vector pi representing a probability distribution over moves either proportionally or greedily with respect to the visit counts and root state. The parameters theta for a deep neural network and AlphaZero are trained by self-play reinforcement learning, starting from randomly initialized parameters theta. Games are played by selecting moves for both players by Monte Carlo tree simulation. At the end of the game, the terminal position S sub t is scored according to the rules of the game to compute the game outcome. A Z is -1 for a loss, 0 for a draw, +1 for a win. The neural network parameter theta are updated so as to minimize the error between the predicted outcome V sub t and the game outcome Z, as to maximize the similarity of the policy vector P sub t to the search probability pi sub t. Specifically, the parameters theta are adjusted by gradient descent on a loss function L that sums over mean squared error the cross entropy losses respectively. Okay, so it's a complicated equation, but I read through all of the meanings in it, and you see it's basically like multiple truth hypothesis will be able to be reduced to a simple function, and it's really going to be very similar to this, where so let me just read on. People could meditate on the equation related to the words. Where C is a parameter controlling the level of L2 weight regularization, the updated parameters are used in subsequent games to self-play. The AlphaZero algorithm described in this paper differs from the original AlphaGo Zero algorithm in several respects. AlphaGo Zero estimates and optimizes the probability of winning, assuming binary win-loss outcomes. AlphaZero instead estimates and optimizes the expected outcome, taking account of draws or potentially other outcomes. The rules of Go are invariant to rotation and reflection. This fact was exploited in AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero in two ways. First, training data was augmented by generating 8 symmetries for each position. Second, during MCTS, board positions were transformed using randomly selected rotation or reflection before being evaluated by the neural networks, so that the Monte Carlo evaluation is averaged over different biases. The rules of chess and shogi are asymmetric, and in general, symmetries cannot be assumed. AlphaZero does not augment the training data and does not transform the board position during a Monte Carlo tree simulation. In AlphaGo Zero, self-play games were generated by the best player from all previous iterations. After each iteration of training, the performance of the new player was measured against the best player. It won by a margin of 55%. Then it replaced the best player in self-play games were subsequent generated by this paper. In contrast, AlphaZero simply maintains a single neural network that is updated continually rather than waiting for an iteration to complete. Training AlphaZero for 700,000 steps here. ELO ratings were computed. So you see the performance related to Go, Shogi, and chess for their rating systems and the number of thousands of steps that had to be performed by the algorithm. Self-play games are generated by using the latest parameter from the neural network, omitting the evaluation step and the selection of best player. AlphaGo Zero turned the hyperparameter of its search by Bayesian optimization, and AlphaZero reused the same hyperparameters for all games without game-specific tuning. The sole exception is the noise that is added to the prior policy to ensure exploration. This is scaled in proportion to the typical number of legal moves for that game type. Like AlphaGo Zero, the board state is encoded by spatial planes based only on the basic rules for each game. The actions are encoded by either spatial planes or flat vector, again based only on the basic rules for each game. We applied the AlphaZero algorithm to chess, shogi, and also Go, unless otherwise specified. The same algorithm settings, network architecture, and hyperparameters were used for all 3 games. We trained separate instances of AlphaZero for each game. Training proceeded for 700,000 steps, mini batches of size 4096, starting from randomly initialized parameters using 5,000 first generation TPUs to generate self-play games and 64 second generation TPUs to train the neural networks. Further details of the training procedure are provided in the methods. So you see the performance. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you see the algorithm and then their performance against the various chess computers. And this is a little old, and chess players could read through this on their own. I'm not doing a chess study here. I want to relate the general findings to my multiple truth hypothesis and thought in general. Okay, so thanks, Jennifer, for monitoring the chat. So this article also has at the end an appendix that has some interesting things I want to read. Anatomy of a computer chess program. In this section, we describe the components of a typical computer chess program, focusing specifically on Stockfish as an open source program that won the 2016 Computer Chess Championship. For an overview of standard method, each position S is described by a sparse vector of handcrafted features, row sub S, including middle endgame specific material point values, material imbalance tables, piece square tables, mobility and trap pieces, pawn structures, king safety, outpost, bishop pair, and other miscellaneous evaluation patterns. Each feature is assigned by a combination of manual and automatic tuning, a corresponding weight, and the position is evaluated by a linear combination. However, this raw evaluation is only considered accurate for positions that are quiet with no unresolved captures or check. A domain-specialized quiescence search is used to resolve ongoing tactical situations before the evaluation function is applied. The final evaluation of position S is computed by a minimax search that evaluates each leaf using a quintet search. Alpha-beta pruning is used to safely cut any branch that is provably dominated by another variation. Additional cuts are achieved using aspiration windows and principal variation search. Other pruning strategies include null move pruning, which assumes a pass move should be worse than any variation in positions that are unlikely to be zugzwang, as determined by simple heuristics. Futility pruning, which assumes knowledge of the maximum possible change in evaluation, and other domain-dependent pruning rules, which assume knowledge of the value of captured pieces. The search is focused on promising variations, both by extending the search depth of promising variations and by reducing the search depth of unpromising variations based on heuristics like history, static exchange evaluations, and moving piece type. Extensions are based on domain-independent rules that identify singular moves with no sensible alternative, and domain-dependent rules such as extending check moves. Reductions such as late move reductions are based heavily on domain knowledge. The efficiency of alpha-beta search depends critically upon the order in which moves are considered. Moves are therefore ordered by iterative depending, using a shallower search to order moves from a deeper search. In addition, a combination of domain-independent move ordering heuristics such as killer heuristic, history heuristic, counter-move heuristic, and other domain-dependent knowledge based on captures and potential captures. Transposition table facilitates the reuse of values and move orders when the same position is reached by multiple paths. Carefully tuned opening book is used to select moves at the start of the game. An endgame table base pre-calculated by exhaustive retrograde analysis of endgame positions provides the optimal move in all positions with 6 and sometimes 7 pieces or less. Other strong chess programs and also earlier programs such as Deep Blue have used very similar architectures, including the majority of components described above, although important details vary considerably. None of the techniques described in this section are used by AlphaZero. It is likely that some of the techniques could further improve the performance of AlphaZero. However, we have focused on pure self-play reinforcement learning approach and leave these extensions for future research. Prior work on computer chess and Shogi. Neurochess evaluated positions by neural network that used 175 handcrafted input features. It was trained by temporal difference learning to predict the final game outcome and also the expected feature after 2 moves. Neurochess won 13% of games against new chess using a fixed step to search. Bale and Smith applied temporal difference learning to estimate piece values in chess and shogi, starting from random values and learned solely by self-play. Nightcap estimated positions by neural network that use an attack table based on knowledge of which squares are attacked and defended by which pieces. It was trained by a variant of temporal difference learning known as TD leaf that updates the leaf value on the principal variation of alpha-beta search. Nightcap achieved human master level after training against a strong computer opponent with hand initialized piece weight values. MEEP evaluated positions by linear evaluation function based on handcrafted features. It was trained by another variant of temporal difference learning known as tree strap that updated all nodes of an alpha-beta search. MEEP defeated human international master players in 13 out of 15 games after training by self-play with randomly initialized weights. Kamino Hoki trained the weights of Shogi evaluation function comprising a million features by learning to select expert human moves during alpha-beta search. They also performed a large-scale optimization based on minimax search regulated by expert game logs. This formed part of the Bonanza engine that won the 2013 World Computer Shogi Championship. Giraffe evaluated positions by neural network that included mobility maps and attack and defend maps describing the lowest valued attacker and defender on each square. It was trained by self-play using TD Leaf, also reaching a standard of play comparable to international masters. Deep Chess trained a neural network to perform pairwise evaluations of positions. It was trained by supervised learning from a database of human expert games that was pre-filtered to avoid capture moves in drawn games. Deep Chess reached a strong grandmaster level of play. All these programs combined their learned evaluation functions with alpha-beta search enhanced by a variety of extensions. An approach based on training dual policy and value networks using AlphaZero-like policy iteration was successfully applied to improve the state-of-the-art in hex. Monte Carlo tree search and alpha-beta search. For at least 4 decades, the strongest computer chess programs have used alpha-beta search. AlphaZero used a markedly different approach that averages over the position evaluation within a subtree rather than computing the minimax evaluation of the subtree. However, chess programs using traditional Monte Carlo tree search were much weaker than alpha-beta search programs. While alpha-beta programs based on neural networks have previously been unable to compete with faster handcrafted evaluation functions. AlphaZero evaluates positions using nonlinear function approximation based on a deep neural network rather than the linear function approximation used by typical chess programs. This provides a much more powerful representation, but may also introduce spurious approximation errors. Monte Carlo tree search averages over these approximation errors, which therefore tend to cancel out when evaluating a large subtree. In contrast, alpha-beta search computes an explicit minimax, which propagates the biggest approximation errors to the root of the subtree. Using Monte Carlo tree search may allow AlphaZero to effectively combine its neural network representation with a powerful domain-independent search. Domain knowledge. The input feature describing the position and the output features describing the move are structured as a set of planes. The neural network architecture is matched to the grid structure of the board. AlphaZero is provided with perfect knowledge of the game rules. These are used during Monte Carlo tree search to stimulate the positions resulting from a sequence of moves to determine game termination and to score any simulations that reach a terminal state. Knowledge of the rules is also used to encode the input plane, castling, repetition, no progress, and output planes, how piece move, promotions, and piece drops. The typical number of legal moves is used to scale the exploration noise. Chess and shogi games exceeding a maximum number of steps determined by typical game length were terminated and assigned to draw outcome. Go games were terminated and scored with a Trompe-Taylor rule similar to previous work. AlphaZero did not use any form of domain knowledge beyond the points listed above. Representation. In this section, we describe the representation of the board inputs and the representation of the action inputs used by neural networks in AlphaZero. Other representations could have been used in our experiment. The training algorithm worked robustly for many reasonable choices. I'm not going to read through that. It's a configuration, evaluate performance. So there's more, and then they have a game selection. So I encourage people to look through that. But I wanted to cover, some of the main components of neural networks and AlphaZero, as seen that it came largely from a game program, most specifically chess. And you see, actually, chess is the basically most important of all fields. There is no field more important to the history of AI and even cognitive science, more so than chess. So let's look now at this concept. So I showed you AlphaZero, and it's going to be important because this neural network understanding to the hard problem of consciousness. And so this also comes from DeepMind of various researchers around the world. And it's this concept called a cognitive map. And we had seen in some of the chess research called template theory, CREST, chunking hierarchy, and structures. And the idea is that you have stored chunks that are just templates that could have exchanged pieces of information within them. So there's various levels of chunking. It's very similar to neural networks, where it's meta levels of abstraction and details could be filled in. And a lot of this research on cognitive map is going to deal with what I talk about most with Church of Entropy usually is the example is spatial processing, because that's the most well researched and also done with like animal research and rat research. And we know it's an essential function of the brain. As where Duvid is eventually, once I finish with this research, going to argue that thought does not in fact come from the brain. So I want to show the research of what likely comes from the brain and what is the evidence and what are they speculating, largely based on computer science, about how they feel that we're going to solve the hard problem of consciousness versus Duvid's multiple truth hypothesis. So this is a long article, but it's very important. This was probably the main article I wanted to learn. Anybody interested in the hard problem of consciousness, there's a lot of good information here, up to date, relatively 2018. What is a cognitive map? Organizing knowledge for flexible behavior. Involved Oxford, out of the UK. I think a lot of the founders of DeepMind from the UK. Abstract. It's proposed that a cognitive map encoding the relationship between entities in the world supports flexible behavior. The majority of the neural evidence for such a system comes from studies of spatial navigation. Recent work describes neuronal parallels between spatial and non-spatial behaviors has rekindled the notion of a systematic organization of knowledge across multiple domains. We review experimental evidence and theoretical frameworks that point to the principles unifying these apparently disparate functions. These principles describe how to learn and use abstract generalizable knowledge and suggest map-like representations observed in the spatial context may be an instance of general coding mechanisms capable of organizing knowledge of all kinds. We highlight how artificial agents endowed with such principles exhibit flexible behavior and learn map-like representations observed in the brain. Finally, we speculate on how these principles may offer insight into the extreme generalizations, abstractions, and inferences that characterize human cognition. And they don't talk that much about free will. Shalom Yochanan, thanks for adding on Facebook and joining. Okay, so you guys want to talk about other things in the chat, but I want to keep this video very narrowly on this topic. Introduction. In the last 2 decades and more, computational behavior neuroscientists have found formal explanations of neural signals that control behavior in carefully controlled repetitive scenarios. In some instances, these models predict neuronal activity with truly exquisite precision. And when paired with heavy computational resources, related algorithms have extraordinary success in training artificial agents to superhuman levels in games as diverse as Atari and Go. However, there is a stark gap between the types of behavior these models can account for and the sophisticated interferences that characterize much of human behavior. Human and animal behavior is flexible. We can choose how to act by exploiting actions that have worked in the past, but also based on experiences that are only loosely related. We can imagine the consequences of entirely novel choices. We can extract importantly features of experiences and generalize them to new situations. These differences were clearly articulated by Tolman as he watched rats make flexible inferences in complex mazes. They would learn rich details of the mazes in the absence of any reward and to the benefit of future behavior. For example, after unrewarded exposure to mazes, rats would take shortcuts to reach rewards or would find new routes when old ones were blocked. Such behaviors inspired Tolman to coin the term cognitive map, referring to a rich internal model of the world that accounts for the relationship between events and predicts the consequences of actions. This is already 1930s, 1946. So see A here, the rat, monkey, and human brain, and the common hippocampus and EC. We'll see what that stands for. The hippocampal zone, anatomical location of the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex in different species adapted. A variety of cells in the hippocampal formation represent different spatial variables. Place cells are active when an animal is in a single location. Grid cells are active when an animal is in one of multiple locations on a triangular lattice. Social place cells are active in one animal when it observes another animal is in a particular location. Head direction cells are active when animals' heads are facing a particular direction. Object vector cells are active when the animal is in a particular direction distant from any object. Reward cells are active when animals in the vicinity of a reward. Boundary vector cells are active at any given distance away from the boundary in a particular allocentric orientation. Goal direction cells are active when the goal of an animal is in a particular direction relative to its current movement direction. The green G indicates the goal location. So here you see the rat hippocampus and entorhinal cortex that's similar in monkeys and humans. There you have the different types of cells, place cell, grid cell, and the locations that these various cells become active during the rat's activities. Okay, Shalom, take care, Yochanan. For Tolman, this cognitive map was a systematic organization of knowledge that spanned all domains of behavior. However, its biggest influence in cognitive neuroscience is the study of spatial behaviors, perhaps because the literal interpretation of the term map gives a clear prediction of neural activity. Even Tolman cannot have imagined the beautiful precision with which map-like representations are reflected in the activity of single neurons in the hippocampal entorhinal system. The most celebrated of these neurons are active at particular places in the map. Place cells in the hippocampus restrict their activity, usually to a single location in space. Grid cells in the medial entorhinal cortex fire at multiple places, fields equally placed on a triangular grid, and are therefore able to represent vector relationships and distances between different spatial locations. All of these comes a veritable zoo of less celebrated but equally remarkable cells that reveal how knowledge is organized in the map, such as band cells and cells that encode the vector relationships to borders, objects, rewards, and goals, alongside cells that encode the current head direction or cells that encode the location of other agents on the map. These spatial cells appear to have specialized function representations, such as each plays an important role in understanding navigating the 2D world. Notably, however, the same brain structures containing these cells play important roles in neural processes that relate to a broader view of a cognitive map, such as generalization, inference, imagination, social cognition, and memory. It is therefore a challenge to understand how such cells might help us organize knowledge in the complex, high-dimensional, non-spatial cognitive map that Tolman envisaged. In this review, we show how recent work is beginning to find unifying explanations for these apparently disparate functions by looking to ideas from reinforcement learning and statistical learning and investigate whether such formalisms may not only explain neural responses in spatial tasks, but also provide opportunities for the types of powerful inferences and generalizations of structural knowledge that underlie flexible human behavior. Organizational structure, knowledge for flexible learning. Whilst Tolman was watching rats running in mazes, another hero psychology, Harlow, was asking human and non-human primates to choose between two stimuli to find a reward. Discriminating a rewarding from an unrewarding stimulus should not require any sophistication or flexibility at all. The animal could just preferentially repeat rewarded choices. But Harlow noticed something interesting. As subjects had more and more experience of the task with different stimuli each time, they got better and better at learning new discriminations, as well as learning which was the better stimulus. The subjects were learning something abstract about how to perform the discrimination. He termed this abstract knowledge a learning set. In the following sections, we will contend that acquiring such a learning set requires an abstract representation of the structures of the task that encodes relationships between the task events. This kind of representation allows inference for remote observations and generalizations of information across different tasks with similar structure. We'll also argue that grid cells activity is an example of such a representation as in the spatial domain, such that grid cells encode statistical regularities in spatial navigation that occur due to the common structure of all two-dimensional spaces. So see these example of learning sets and sample tasks and performance, reward schedule, flexibility, and conceptual map. So the importance of learning set, Harlow and beyond. We'll describe 3 tasks relying on learning sets, demonstrating the learning of task structure from repeated exposure to the same task, and demonstrate the implications of OFC lesions on part of the learning set common across many different tasks. So first, we saw a schematic of Harlow's task. Different instantations of the task share a common underlying structure. Only one object is rewarded. That can be exploited to facilitate faster learning. The accuracy data from over multiple exposures to the task, monkeys acquire this underlying structure termed a learning set and use it to learn faster in new instantations of the task. So we saw here the learning set and then the performance improvement. Monkeys can also learn to track changing probabilities of reward, but OFC lesions cause an intriguing deficit whereby they can track changes in reward unless the best option reverses. This is because they no longer know which recent choice caused which recent reward. In these regression plots, correct attribution between choice and reward is on the diagonal. OFC lesioned animals learn using the off-diagonal terms, which imply that if an average recent reward is high, the animal increases their preference for their average recent choice, ignoring the choice caused which reward. We have those graphs and the reversal or the lesion, or the, and then here would be D, E, and F, spatial representation of the influence of recent rewards, a state space. Takahashi showed a similar effect in rodents, demonstrated that it would be accounted for by a model in which the animal could not distinguish latent states. Reduced state diagram showed here the states reward after left choice and reward after right choice are represented separately in the model that best accounts for control data. The fact that they are not in the model that best accounts for OFC lesion data reflects the rodent's inability to pair the reward with the choice that caused it. We refer to the reader to the beautiful paper on other examples of state space deficits caused by OFC lesions. The learning set for the task is composed not only from the abstract structure common to different realizations of a specific task, but also from basic knowledge, which is a generalization to many tasks. For example, the notion of contingency that a choice leads to the immediate following outcome is a feature of many different tasks and life experience. This part of the learning set underlies the result. The full learning set model might consist of many higher ordering across task learning sets converging to different degree on each task-specific learning set. I'm sorry if I didn't put the paper in the chat. Anyone watching wants a link to the paper, there's the paper. To acquire such a learning set, you need to abstract relationships between different stimuli, such as if one stimulus is rewarded, the other is not, or the reward stimulus might change after a number of trials. Part of this learning process includes learning basic knowledge about how the task works. For example, you need to know the reason you are getting a reward now is because the stimulus you chose and not the stimulus from 3 trials ago or the door that just opened in the corridor. When lesions are made to the ventral prefrontal cortex, orbifrontal and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex in McHugh monkeys, this ability is abolished. Animals no longer assign the credit for each reward in the contingent choice that it caused it, but instead to imprecise running average of recent choices. After the PCF lesions, the monkeys that once knew the structure of the task now learn by smooth temporal correlations. While such a strategy can work well in stable environments, it leads to disastrous performance when behavioral flexibility is required, such as when reward contingencies change. These prefrontal cortex properties are not unique to the brains of monkeys and humans. fMRI signals in the prefrontal cortex reflects precise task contingencies when other reward signals in the brain do not. In rodents, if unilateral lesions are made to the OFC, dopaminergic cells in the same hemisphere continue to report vertical reward prediction error, but with a prediction that no longer reflects which choice has caused the reward. What does it mean to have a representation of the structure of a problem? Think about these issues more formally as led a richer understanding. Reinforcement learning, such as behavioral control problems, can be best cast in terms of trying to find a policy that will maximize long-term cumulative reward. This problem is characterized by state S and a probabilistic transition between states, which may be controlled by actions A. The policy pi determines the probability of choosing each action in each state. Pi equals the probability of the action A within state S. If R denotes the instantaneous reward received at a current state, V sub pi denotes the expected cumulative reward over the foreseeable future under a policy, and why the discount factor weighting immediate rewards higher than after some maths, and our goal becomes finding a policy that maximizes value. And here you see the equation. This is extremely similar to the equation I just showed in the AlphaGo paper. In this framework, the burden of representing the problem structure is carried by the state definition S and the transition. These respectively describe how is the task divided up into different elements. For example, the state of having just seen a particular stimulus and how one element leads to another. Wilson and colleagues showed that the credit assignment deficits described above, along with other types of deficits commonly observed after ventral prefrontal lesions, are predicted by a reinforcement learning agent that only learns from intermediate sensory observations and does not assign credit to abstract states. It is argued then that activity in the OFC must encode the current location in latent or unobserved state space. Indeed, this exact information can be decoded for the OFC fMRI signal when humans engage in complex tasks with a well-defined state space. To account for effects of learning set, however, a state representation must do more than simply label the current state. First, it must encode how the state relates to other states in the world. Second, it must encode states in a fashion that generalizes across different sensory realizations of the task. Key feature of both Harlow's experiment and the OFC task is that every example of the task used different stimuli, but animals improved on the task nevertheless. Indeed, when monkeys are asked to make economic choices between different amounts of two juices, OFC neurons encode a rich variety of value and task-related variables. But when the two juices are replaced with two different juices, the same neurons encode the exact same variables for the new juices. Indeed, lesions to neighboring regions cause particular deficits in generalizing knowledge between different stimuli sets. Here you have orientation, realignment, global mapping, MEC and OFC neurons generalize across different contexts. In the spatial remapping experiments, animals are moved between two different environments. Etheroinal grid cells maintain a constant spatial phase structure in contrast with the global remapping of hippocampal place cells. MEC object vectors cells respond specifically when an animal is given a direction and a distance from any object, regardless of identifying the object. Cells with object vector properties are also found in the hippocampus. These cells, however, respond to only a subset of objects. MEC data from hippocampal data. When monkeys choose between a pair of different juices offered in different amounts, OFC neurons encode the same decision variables across contexts, such that two neurons supporting the same decision from one pair of juices also support the same decision in different pairs of juices. Firing rates of an example OFC neuron as a function of the quantity ratio of the two juices. Black symbols represent the percentage of trials in which the monkey chose the less preferred juice. Red symbols represent the average firing rate. Population analysis demonstrated OFC neurons generalized over different contexts. Each task-related OFC neuron was classified according to its strongest encoded decision variable and the site of this encoding. This was done in two separate contexts. Numbers or cell counts for encoding a pair of variables. In the two contexts, statistical significance was assessed via null distribution. The strong diagonal indicates neurons tend to encode the same variable with the same sign in both contexts. So you see the orientations of cells, hippocampal, the prefrontal cortex, the vector cells. Generalizing spatial representations. So far, we've argued that prefrontal cortex representations in learning tasks have three important computational properties. One, they encode location in the state space of the task. The representations of location embed structural knowledge of the relationship between different states. And three, can be generalized across tasks with shared statistical structure but different sensory events. These three features of OFC activity resemble the key computational properties of etheroinal cells in spatial domains. Grid cells famously encode locations in spatial tasks. They do so with representations that has implicit within it knowledge of the spatial relationship between all locations, allowing remote inference. And this structural code generalizes across different sensory environments. To understand this final point, consider what happens in a hippocampal remapping experiment in which animals are moved between two different boxes. In these experiments, hippocampal place cells remap, and when the sensory environment changes, neighboring place cells in one environment are unlikely to be neighbors in the other. By contrast, except for a rigid body change, grid cells do not remap between environments within a module. Phase neighbors in one environment and phase neighbors in the other. The etheroinal representations of locations therefore embeds the structural information about general relationships in 2D space that is common amongst all environments. Similarly, object vector cells in entorhinal cortex activate for any object present in the environment, where similar cells in the hippocampus activate for only a subset of objects. With these relationships in mind, it is intriguing that deficits in learning can be achieved by transection of the fornix, which disconnects the frontal cortex from the hippocampus, or the frontotemporal disconnection. Similar interactions between the OFC and hippocampus appear to be important for correctly updating task representation in humans and rodents. It is therefore interesting to understand how we can relate these more generalized forms of behavior to hippocampal representations familiar from spatial navigation tasks. These relationships may be more than simply theoretical. By casting reinforcement learning problems into continuous but non-spatial domains, recent studies suggest that place and grid cells have a broader role than the coding of physical space. These studies show activity of cells in the same regions as place and grid cells measured either from fMRI or directly code for non-spatial information in a manner analogous to the coding of spatial information. In humans, it is possible to record grid-like activity during virtual reality navigation, either directly from the activity of entorhinal cells during surgery or inherently with fMRI. Whilst fMRI cannot give access to cellular activity directly, the hexagonal symmetry of the grid pattern is striking shadow in the fMRI signal. As subjects move in the virtual reality environment, fMRI activity exhibits a six-fold oscillation as a function of running direction. Notably, this pattern can be observed not only when the subjects navigate in virtual spatial worlds, but also when they're engaged in an operant non-spatial task that is the same statistical structure as space, like 2D continuous organization. Instead of moving in space, subjects watch as a cartoon bird morphs in two dimension. Their task is to predict when these birds will match the appearance of one of several target birds that are associated with different rewards. These instantaneous change to the appearance of the bird describes a vector in 2D conceptual space defined by the neck and leg length and grid-like coding as inferred by looking at a six-fold oscillation in fMRI activity as a function of this vector. This pattern can be observed in the entorhinal cortex, but also in the brain regions, including ventral frontal cortex. By contrast, in hippocampus cells fire specific abstract stimuli, such as Jennifer Aniston, and therefore code information in a fashion analogous to place cells in spatial domain. Generalization in spatial representations. So A, logic behind measuring grid cells with fMRI trajectories through a two-dimensional space can be either aligned or misaligned with the axis of the grid code. Greater signal for trajectories aligned versus misaligned with the grid results in a hexagonally symmetric sinusoidal modulation of fMRI signal with movement direction adapted from 2010 study. In B, this modulation of the fMRI signal providing evidence for grid cells is observed in the entorhinal cortex when participants navigate through virtual reality spatial worlds. Left is an aerial view of the spatial task map. C, the same signal is observed when participants navigate through an abstract conceptual space defined by two continuous dimensions, the neck length and the leg length of stretchy birds. Suggested grid cells code for non-spatial dimension. Right here, D. Cells in the hippocampus fire specific sound frequencies in a non-spatial sound manipulation task in a manner analogous to the representation of spatial locations and place cells in a linear track. In both panels, each horizontal line shows normalized activity in one cell as a function of either distance along a linear spatial track or a sound frequency. Cells are ordered according to the position of the firing field, top adapted from and bottom adapted from, grid-like coding in entorhinal cortex of linear spatial track, and progression through the sound manipulation task. These are adapted from various other studies the author is quoting. So it'd be interesting, some point, Jennifer helps out to actually try to correspond this to Quantum Mind. I'm down to only 2 viewers. I understand this is hard for other people to watch, but hopefully this is beneficial, at least to myself or others who want to learn more about the topic or want some help trying to get through these difficult papers. Similarly, for rodents, the task of holding a lever whilst a tone increases in frequency and then releasing it at target frequency to get a reward is not obviously a spatial one, but it has a topology similar from space. One frequency leads to the next in an operant box in the same way as one place leads to the next in a linear track. When rodents perform this task, hippocampal cells exhibit place-like firing fields, but for different frequencies rather than places. In entorhinal cells, including spatial grid cells, exhibit multiple distinct fields at different frequencies that resemble the firing fields of grid cells on a linear track. Grid cells also encode grazed locations on a 2D image in both non-human and human primates. There's evidence then that place and grid patterns are neither unique to spatial navigation, nor in humans at least unique to the hippocampal formation. Instead, they may reflect the 2D topology that is inherent to space, as well as characterize other domains. These results suggest the role of place and grid cells in spatial cognition in a specific instance of more general coding mechanism realized in the hippocampus connected regions. Unifying spatial and non-spatial coding under a common framework. In order to understand more formally what this means, it is useful to return to the reinforcement learning framework laid out in the previous section. Because reinforcement learning is a general framework, it is not limited to explaining operant tasks. It can equally easily be used to give a fresh perspective on the spatial navigation problem. For example, considering the rat running on a linear track, using the reinforcement learning framework, we could express this task by choosing our states S to be the different locations along the track. The probability the rat moves from the state to state depends on its policy, and if given by, I'm not going to read the mathematical equations, but encourage people to. However, if we ignore the effects of the policy and assume that all movement is through diffusion, random walk on the graph, then this same equation tells us the environment's transition probabilities between states. This matrix effectively tells us which states are neighbors and therefore on a linear track encapsulate the one-dimensional topology of the problem space. It is useful matrix to know. If you are planning your future and want to know where you will likely be at the next time step, you can simply multiply your current state vector S by T to give you TS. In 2 time steps, your state probability distribution will be T squared times S, and in 3 steps, T cubed times S. This type of future thinking is an example of model-based reinforcement learning, where an agent that knows the states and transitions and therefore has a model of the world can simulate its future step by step and make decisions about which future is best. Whilst there is a strong evidence for this type of future projection at choice points in spatial tasks, it is very different in spirit to how we think about most navigation problems. In navigation problems, instead of sequentially planning through each neighboring location, agents are able to use the known Euclidean properties of 2D space to infer local vectors that will connect distant points. Can similar inferences be made in reinforcement learning state X spaces? Without delving deep into the mathematics, there is a set of vectors from which it is possible to compute all the n-step transition matrix of T to the n by simple linear combination. These are the eigenvectors of T. These vectors linearly encode all futures, and from then it is easy to compute differences between any pairs of state without the need for expensive step-by-step simulation. For continuous worlds, these eigenvectors are periodic, and in 2D worlds, they have grid-like properties. So if anyone's watching this, you could pause on the picture while I read the words. Unifying spatial and non-spatial representations under a common framework. Reinforcement learning can offer a fresh perspective on spatial cognition by considering locations as state. For example, linear track can be thought of as a series of neighboring states. This 1D topology can be represented in states by state transition matrix T, with elements T, I, J corresponding to the probability of transitioning from state I to J. Thus, this matrix represents structure. Indeed, multiplication of the current state S by T of n gives a distribution over state occupancy n steps in the future. Notably, eigenvectors from this transition matrix are periodic, suggesting they contain non-local knowledge about the structure that may be useful for computing distances. Grid-like self-firing cells can be obtained by casting 2D space under this space state framework. The eigenvectors of the covariance of 2D distributed place cells or 2D transition matrix in the successor representation of 2D space state are all grid-like and are units of an artificial neural network tasked with predicting 2D distribution place cells and head direction cells. Figures adapted from different studies. These grid-like representations embed structural knowledge from the relationship between states. Since the eigenvectors of T are also the eigenvectors of the successor representation, they can be used to compute approximate distances between all pairs of states, which can be used to facilitate planning. Grid codes provide a basis for vector-based navigation, allowing the artificial neural network with grid-like units to take shortcuts. Using representations that, rather than coding current locations, are predictive of successive states, it is possible to explain policy-dependent phenomenon in the hippocampal formation. For example, if an animal moves only one way down the linear track, successors representation skew towards the start of the track to predict their future state, as observed in the hippocampal place cells. The same work can explain the neural representations in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex of a discrete non-spatial state space. The true underlying graph structure of the state space can be reconstructed from neural activity, suggesting these regions represent discrete as well as continuous tasks. So, Church of Entropy and the eigenvectors, power of the eigenvector. It is notable that because place cells index overlapping states in a 2D world, these eigenvectors are also the principal components of place cell activity. The eigengrid code can therefore also be thought of as a code that captures the variance on the place-like cell population in an information-efficient manner. Indeed, when a recurrent neural network is trained to predict place cells activity or location as it navigates around an open field, it develops grid-like cells as its preferred linear representation. By using these cells in more complex environments, it can solve navigation problems that require vector navigation. To date, we have been considering how to represent likely future experiences in situations where the world has useful structure but behavior is random. In fact, because transitions depend on choice, the expected transition probabilities T change if the animal shows statistical regularity in its behavior. This policy dependence can be harnessed to make predictions about hippocampal representations that are not immediately obvious from spatial considerations alone. To do this, it is necessary to re-envision the place cell representations. Instead of coding where the animal is now, once an animal becomes familiar with the environment, it's possible to encode its best estimate of where it will be in the imminent future. This is clearly a useful representation for controlling behavior. It allows the animal to rapidly evaluate which local choices have profitable futures. In reinforcement learning, this is termed a successor representation, as it predicts the expected successor states by assuming that the place cells encode the successor rather than current locations. It's possible to account for a number of seemingly disparate findings in the place cell literature, such as the tendency to place field to stretch slowly towards the start of a one-way linear track or to clump in high densities around the rewarding locations. The general framework goes some way to explain why place and grid representations are not unique to spatial situations, but also implies that they should not be unique to continuous environments. Whilst this is an ongoing topic of investigation, there is suggestive evidence that it will be a profitable one. Humans fMRI similarity measures in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex respect the statistical transitions of a discrete state spaces, even when subjects are unaware that transitions are non-random. By examining these representations, it is possible to reconstruct directly from the neural data state distance matrices that resemble the true transition or successor distances between states. In operant tasks, rather than stimulating all possible transitions online, there is evidence human behavior relies on precompiled transition distances consistent with the successor or eigenrepresentations, and that these precompiled distances rely on offline activity in hippocampus and ventral frontal cortex. Similarly, in a rodent operant task, manipulators either hippocampus or orbitofrontal cortex prevent the animals from using the state transition structure to guide their next choice. Inferences, abstractions, and factorized representations of tasks. Within either a reinforcement learning task or a spatial environment, then a clever representation of how states are related can allow for flexible inferences. But how does the brain come from such pardon me. But how does the brain come by such representations each time it encounters a new problem? In this section, we argue that structural knowledge can be abstracted away from its sensory inputs and therefore generalized to new environments, state spaces, and tasks. We argue that some structural representations are broadly required across many tasks that require flexible inferences of rapid learning. As discussed, such inferences are routinely made by animals in the spatial domain. One way to understand how an animal might take a new shortcut, for example, is to consider that the statistical structure of 2D space places strong constraints on what state transitions are possible. When the animal is moving in a spatial environment, it samples some of those states and transitions and can use prior structural knowledge to fill in many states and transitions that it had not seen, but are implied by the 2D nature of the problem. And there are other situations in nature where similar constraints might apply. Are there non-spatial scenarios where humans and animals can make structural inferences with no prior experience of a problem? To find them, we don't have to look far, either in topological complexity or neural anatomy. If animals are independently taught that they should choose stimulus A over B and B over C, they will infer that they should choose A over C on first presentation, a phenomenon known as the transitive inference. In primates, such lists can be long and can be flexibly reconfigured, for example, stitched together by presentation of the critical link. Similar animals can stitch together temporal distinct episodes into a linear time representation and use this representation to make causal inferences. A sensory preconditioning paradigm, for example, animals are taught that A leads to B and that B leads to reward. When they are later asked to choose between A and a control, they choose A, the stimulus that implies a path toward reward. Whilst it is possible to solve both of these tasks by simpler associative mechanism, in the case of transitive inference, at least, evidence strongly suggests that animals instead rely on abstract knowledge of the linear structure. For sensory preconditioning, the jury is still out in animals, but any reader who is able to decipher the plots of Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill from the sporadic, interleaved, and oftentimes reversed episodes will know the answer for humans. Notably, both transitive inference and sensory precondition require hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, and ventral prefrontal cortex. For example, manipulations to any of these structures will preserve an animal's preference for A over B or for B over C, but abolish the preference for A over C. So see, A is the transference inference in different domains. B, the hippocampal dependence of transitive inference states. F, transfer linear structure to different toy car domains. C, constrained inference in maze with similar structures. D, social networks with the same topology permit same inferences. Plot of Kill Bill 1 and 2 arranged in chronological order. Transitive inference and structural constraints on inference. A breakdown of the experience inference and the choice test time and spatial navigation and transitive inference both rely on chaining together separately observed sequences of observation. The transitive inference is hippocampally dependent in rats. Rats were trained on a pair of consecutive stimuli in which reward stimulus in each trial followed the order A is greater than B greater than C greater than D greater than E. If the animal represents the stimulus order rather than simply the results of the experience pairs, it can correctly infer that B should be preferred over D. Control animals make this inference correctly, while animals with lesions that separate hippocampus from the cortex are impaired in these relational probes. The illustration of the mazes that permit different types of structured inferences in maze 1, neither of the first two trajectories traverse the shorter path solution. However, pieces from the traversals can be joined to compose the shortest path. In similar structured maze 2, the observed trajectories are insufficient to compose the shortest path. However, the loop closure suggests topological similarity to the previously observed maze 1. This similar previously experienced relational structure can be used to constrain inference in the new maze with a representation that factors observation from underlying structure. So you have the picture of the maps and the graphs, the hippocampal dependence, and you see the picture of the template for like a social a network for understanding information template. And I guess Kill Bill 1 and 2 that were not shot in chronological order, so the scenes in them here, so to say, put together in a chronological order that the brain naturally performs the function, at least in humans. Prior experience with topological features can be used to constrain inference in non-spatial environments as well. For instance, exposure to the abstract notion of a high-degree node, which arises in many different types of social networks, can be used to draw conclusions about the role of a high-degree individual in novel network. For instance, the Queen Bee, the Queen of England, and Beyonce are members of very different social networks, but fill a similar role of influence relative to other individuals in the network. Humans can fluidly chain together episodes experience out of order into a continuous narrative. This is elegantly illustrated in artist's depiction of the plot of Kill Bills 1 and 2, arranged in chronological orders. Although scenes in Kill Bill are seen out of order, such that early scenes depicting some of the events are qualified by later scenes depicting an earlier event, a viewer can integrate these scenes into a coherent narrative. Other films with this property include Memento and Pulp Fiction. In the line The Car of Max Baron's Age 2, organization within each line suggests that the structures can be placed within other structures. This organization is readily visible in the left-hand line, but will be most apparent in the right-hand line to readers with domain experience in the Disney series Cars. Okay, so hopefully people see why I was excited to read this article in its complete totality. I will not be reading 5 articles. Maybe I will read 3 today. So this one's pretty. What experience have in common? Why should the brain learn general structural representations rather than build a new representation for each task? For this to be a useful strategy, there must be regularities in the world that can be profited from. Indeed, there are. This world is brimming with repetition and self-similarity in every level of abstraction. Knowledge can be generalized about objects and concrete entities. If you find a fish in a lake, it's worth checking other lakes for fish. Or about transition structures, multiple rooms often lead from the same corridor, or about a relationship between objects and transitions. If you reach a sad point in a film, you are probably about halfway in. Repetitions exist in the relationships between objects. If 2 people are friends on Facebook, they probably follow similar people on Twitter. Crucially, the structures that organize these self-repetitions often themselves repeat across nature. Tree-like organization, for example, can be found in families, in rumor mills, and even trees. Small worlds and scale-free properties are found in complex systems across the natural world. Across life, then, a learner faces a distribution of tasks, and this distribution is not random but highly structured. Each new task can be constrained by a rich prior information from previous tasks. Harlow's learning set is a clear controlled example. In Harlow's experiment, what is randomized between episodes is the identity of each object, while what is constant is the relationship between object and reward. Harlow's interpretation of learning to learn was the past experiments drove the acquisition of abstract structure. For example, the fact that one of the 2 objects is always rewarded, and this learned representation made future learning more efficient. Recent approaches in artificial neural networks have demonstrated that with enough experience, powerful and general structural representations can emerge from simple principles. In the following sections, we will highlight some of the principles that seem particularly relevant to the neural representations and anatomical constraints that can be found in the frontal cortex and hippocampal formation. Learning structure from experience. Deep learning techniques can learn powerful representations of tasks that closely resemble biology, and there are several approaches for adapting these techniques to learn structural knowledge that are collectively referred to as meta-learning. But one with a tantalizing link to the brain function is meta-reinforcement learning. Here you got tasks and black arrows, individual tasks and training distribution, and the red arrow, common structure. Meta-learning and reinforcement learning. A learner faces a distribution of tasks that share common underlying structure. Consider again the Harlow task. In many individual episodes, the actual sensory motor reward contingencies are such that there are many possible algorithms that would work to obtain reward. For example, always choose the blue object or choose the left object unless the left object is different from the last time and the square object is on the right. However, the only thing that is common across all the different task episodes is one of the 2 objects is always rewarded. The red arrow here. Common structure is what meta-learning seeks to acquire to facilitate future learning. With a slow enough learning rate such that individual task episodes do not dominate the learning, the result is that the solution can be learned that works for all tasks. One method for performing meta-learning is meta-reinforcement learning. The meta-reinforcement learning architecture from Wang 2018 consists of a prefrontal network modeled as a recurrent neural network with synaptic weights adjusted through a reinforcement learning algorithm driven by dopamine. At each step, the agent receives the current observation and the past action and reward, which are fed into recurrent neural networks that outputs an action and state value estimate. The recurrent neural network learns to use its activation dynamics at a second freestanding reinforcement learning algorithm adapted to the task distribution on which it's trained. And we have, through training, meta-reinforcement learning learns to learn faster on how those tasks, similar to the monkeys, adapted. Also, the Wang 2018 meta-reinforcement learning provides a possible explanation for how individuals' units in the prefrontal cortex become tuned to various task-related variables. Proportion of recorded neurons in the monkeys' prefrontal cortex with sensitivity to last action, last reward, action by reward, interaction, and current value. And each unit in the trained meta-reinforcement learning agent strengthens the correlation with the same variables. Meta-reinforcement learning solves the reinforcement learning problem, maximizes expected task reward with a recurrent neural network whose weights are trained through a reward prediction error signal. The critical insight, however, is that the network does not need to change its weights to react to rewards and errors in solving the current task. Such reactions can instead be coded in the dynamics of the network, because the recurrent neural network can provably implement any algorithm. It can implement an reinforcement learning algorithm if it is trained to do so. The network weights are then trained to maximize reward over many different tasks by setting a learning rate that is too slow to accommodate learning within a single task, but appropriate to average experiences across many tasks. The consequence of this is that the reward prediction error signal drives the weights to encode the structure that is common across episodes rather than information about any particular sensory inputs. The activation dynamics of the network can then profit from this structure to produce rapid learning in each task. For example, how those tasks, like the humans and non-human primates, after many training episodes, the network can learn to solve the problem in one trial. And other experiments also found that meta-reinforcement learning learned abstract notions about the dynamics of the environment independent of the current state and used these to learn more efficiently from new experience. This observation provides a potential solution to an intriguing conundrum in the neuroscience and reinforcement learning. Dopamine signals a reward prediction error that is assumed to cause learning, but in prefrontal cortex at least triggers synaptic change over the wrong time scale, tens of seconds at the fastest, when behavior can change within a few seconds or less. Meta-reinforcement learning proposed that instead of driving learning directly, the role of dopamine is to drive changes in the learning algorithm. This learning algorithm is implemented in the recurrent circuits, particularly centering on the prefrontal cortex. Consistent with this, when the meta-reinforcement learning agent is trained on a typical reward learning task, individual units in the network acquire tuning properties that resemble individual prefrontal cortex units recorded in monkeys in the same text. For example, in a foraging task, found a variety of units in the monkey prefrontal cortex, with some coding predominantly for its value, other for previous actions, others for reward, and still others for action by reward interaction. When meta-reinforcement learning was trained to perform the same task, individual units in the artificial network spontaneously acquired tuning for these variables with similar distribution to the monkey neurons. Factorization and constraints. How should structural knowledge be represented? It is, of course, possible to represent relationships between objects in an implicit fashion encoded in the synaptic weights between object representations. For example, in sensory preconditioning, one can easily imagine scenarios in which cells from the representation of object A form new synaptic connections with those that encode object B. Indeed, such mechanisms likely do exist in the brain. However, in order to structural abstraction, such as the linear order in a transitive inference in sensory preconditioning, or the 2D layout of physical and bird space, to generalize from one task to another, its representation must be explicit, divorced from the sensory properties of the particular task in question, and should be in a form that allows it to impose its constraints on any new sensory environment. One way to enforce such a representation mathematically is to require the representation to factorize, such that the probability distribution of activity for a task event is the product of two independent distributions defining the sensory and structural contributions of the task. Mathematically like this, the probability of the sensory and structure together is the probability of the sensor times the sensory of the structure. So the probability is, for example, defined over the spiking R of each neuron in the representation. Factorization facilitates learning because it dramatically reduces the dimensionality of the representation to be learned and allows extreme forms of generalization outside the training data. For example, if you want to predict how your daughter will react to a blue cup, that you can learn the blue distribution of all blue things and the cup distribution from all colors. Using these two independent distributions, you can predict conjunctions you have never experienced. Similarly, in this representational line factor resides from the representation of the element of that line. It can be learned across many different tasks and generalized to new ones. These considerations are intriguing when considered the cellular representations that can be found in the hippocampal formation and its inputs. If the brain regions that precede hippocampal activity by one or a small number of synapses, representations are separated into structural representations in the medial regions and sensory representations of the lateral regions. By contrast, hippocampus proper contains conjunctive representations of objects and structure. Cells are only active for a particular object in a particular location, but not for the object or location alone. Whilst the conjunctive hippocampal representation is sufficient to fully represent the current episodes, cortical regions that summarize the statistics of these episodes do so in a factorized, data-efficient manner that can be conjoined to hippocampus to represent episodes that have never been experienced. The color in the cups, his daughter. Factorizing conjunctive codes. Entities in the world can be factorized into independent distributions defining the dimensions of these entities. For example, different objects may be factorized according to how cuppy they are as well as their color. Factorization allows generations to as yet seen conjunctions. For example, it's easy to imagine young children with unusual color preferences. The functional representations of the hippocampal ethereal system are suggestive of factorization and conjunction. In the hippocampus outputs, in the hippocampus input, medial region code structure devoid of sensory information, lateral regions code sensory information devoid of structure. They are combined in a conjunctive code in the hippocampus. So here it denotes the separation, a simple task environment containing a graph with different objects of the ventrices, an artificial neural network that explicitly encourages factorizing conjunctive codes, learns units with properties similar to grid and plane cells. Units representing the structures of the environment in the case of 2D topology have periodic firing fields similar to the grid cells. A square rather than a triangular lattice is learned due to a four-way connected space. Units coding for the conjunction between the learned structure and sensory events exhibit remapping similar to place cells. So seeing that two different templates can combine in the hippocampus to form one template, and this is leading to theories on consciousness, where you see that these, what is consciousness? So that's why I'm reading this whole thing straight out. So sorry for the pause here. Let me finish. By modeling such a factorized system in a neural network, it is possible to examine the properties of the structural representation. Just like rodents we discussed earlier, when tasked with predicting the next sensory input in 2D random walk, the network can profit from knowledge of 2D spatial structures. For example, it can infer such things as if I go up, left, down, and right, I will be back in the same place. This allows for correct predictions of sensory events when revisiting states, even when approaching from entirely new direction. Knowing the structure means knowing where you are in space. To do this, the network must learn a factorized representation of the structure. This structural representation can then be combined with sensory events in a conjunctive code to form different memories at different places in different rooms. The learned structural representations include periodic cells, but also cells that resemble boundary cells and boundary vector cells. Since sensory events may occur in different locations in different rooms, the conjunction between a given sensory event and the structural representations may be in different locations across rooms. Therefore, the conjunctive unit naturally exhibit remapping analogous to the firing of place cells in different environments. It is possible then that at least some of the cell types that make up the rich spatial representation of the hippocampal formation can be accounted for by structural considerations that generalize to arbitrary non-spatial problems. Structural basis and the hippocampal zoo. We have argued that repeated structural constraints on tasks should be embedded implicitly in the neural code, and that entorhinal cells provide examples of such a representation. For simple tasks such as reversal learning or object discrimination, it is possible for the brain to represent the exact transitions from one state to the next, but this strategy will break as soon as anything changes in the structure. For example, the appearance of a shiny object dramatically changes the transition statistics of all tasks. If you are a magpie, more prosaically, although boundaries always have the same effect on transitions, they might do so in different parts of the state space in different environments. One solution to the problem is to think of the entorhinal cells as a basic set for describing the current transition structure, so that different combinations of cellular activity can represent the different structural constraints of different environments, similar to how cells in primary visual cortex representations of a basic basis for describing the pixel distributions in natural images. These bases will capture common features across tasks, whilst the most reliable of these features will most strongly be represented, such as the translational scale invariance of grid cells. There will also be more minor representations of features that have less prominent structural influence. Indeed, recent evidence suggests that activity in many entorhinal cells that are hard to classify into easily interpretable cell types are nevertheless linearly predictive of task-relevant behavioral variables. When starting a new task, the recurrent neural network in the entorhinal cortex may represent an initial guess at the task structure from which the hippocampus can form conjunctive codes and memories. With task experience, a more appropriate weighting of the base function can be inferred, and thus task structure more correctly approximated. This interpretation is consistent with the strong attractor dynamics apparent in the grid cell network, as grid cells embed the relationships that are most prevalent among spatial tasks. Given known hippocampal involvement in primate behaviors with markedly different statistical structure from space, it is possible that other statistical features are also similar, deeply embedded. What should be built by evolution and what should be learned from your environment? Learning about structure and assuming constraints are highly complementary. The more abstract a structure is, the harder it is to learn. But such abstractions can be easily hard-coded by evolution. For example, the factorization of relationship from objects in the cortical code immediately bestows the abstract principle that different pairs of objects might have relationships in common. To obtain such an abstract bias with meta-learning alone can be extremely difficult, because it is hard to make such a diverse task distribution that is principle is the only thing that tasks have in common. Indeed, modern machine learning techniques are exploring how to hard code these abstract biases in artificial neural networks. For example, the current state of the art in StarCraft was achieved by adding a relation network component that employs exactly this principle. By contrast, meta-learning is better suited for discovering complex biases that are difficult to program directly and which may be unexpected properties of task families of interest. These two different strengths play well together. Starting with an abstract architecture bias can make other, more specific or complex biases easier to meta-learn and can encourage more generalizable structural representations to emerge. Indeed, the representations learned in the factorizing network described above are the basis functions which generalize to environments of different sizes. Pure meta-learning without any inductive biases, however, may require a broader task distribution to learn such generalizable representations. Thus, evolution should provide architectural biases that facilitate generalizable structural learning. It is still unclear how much of the bias observed in the brain, like a belief in the relational structure, is completely hardcore versus learned through early life experiences. It is, of course, possible that particular structural constraints that apply broadly across natural tasks have been favored on evolutionary timescales and are therefore hardwired in cortical connectivity. Such an argument might explain the precise anatomical arrangement of grid cell modules along the dorsal ventral axis of either cortex. Implications of the cognitive map. The remainder of this review, we would like to take a more speculative position and consider what implications to the structural abstractions we have discussed above might have on the systematic organization of knowledge that Tolman envisaged. This organization clearly encompasses much more than representations of structural abstractions, but these structures constrain how concrete objects and actions will be combined. These constraints not only allow objects to be configured into meaningful current or future events, but also provide a powerful means to generalize learning from sparse observations. Inferential planning. In both machine learning and neuroscience research, it is often assumed that planning your future involves searching through a tree of possible states and discovering the best one. This process is so costly as to be impossible in most reasonable circumstances, So an alternative is to estimate a cached value of states that are your immediate neighbors or neighbors to some depth. Armed with structural knowledge, however, it is possible that plans can be built into representations in analogous fashion to the representation of objects on transitive inference lines. The planning process now becomes an inference of what should go where on the line. This inference is further constrained by domain-specific structural knowledge of relationships between items. When planning a lab, a PI does not search through every possible arrangement, but instead knows that they should hire the theorist before the experiments to avoid wasted experiments, and the experimentalist before the data science to avoid twiddled thumbs. By constraining the representations of the different objects by this relational knowledge, the number of possible futures are limited. If similar structural knowledge has been used in previous plans, such as building a house, then all that is necessary to build the new plan is for the object's representation to contain information about which other objects this structural knowledge applies to. The new plan can then be generalized, inferred from the old. This is an extension of ideas in psychology where object representation are assumed to encompass possible actions that the object affords. The representation of the word apple, for example, might include activity that represents the facial movements required to eat it and the hand position required to grip it. And this way, infinite possible actions are reduced to only a few likely ones conditioned on the objects currently available. Placed together with structural relational knowledge, however, such representations would provide dramatic constraints on possible long-term futures and powerful generalizations to novel scenarios. Whereas there's little experimental evidence these lines to date, it is notable that what evidence there is centers on the hippocampus and ventral medial prefrontal cortex. These regions are active during both reconstructive memory and constructive imagination, and without these regions, people can't construct imagined futures. Indeed, when subjects imagine a taste of the new food that they have never experienced but is constructed from known ingredients, both regions show evidence that cellular ensembles for the ingredients are active simultaneously. The example above gives a sense of the power of combining different structural representations and the same structural representations being generalized across domains. The logic is similar in spirit to arguments made about the compositional nature of human visual understanding, where known elements can be composed into new objects that can be immediately understood with no prior experience. This analogy, however, highlights the importance of a feature of structural coding emphasized in earlier sections. In order for structures to play an analogous role in compositional planning as objects do in compositional vision, they cannot be encoded solely into the synaptic weights between objects representation. They must be represented explicitly, as are the objects that they act upon. Indeed, this blurring of the line between of objects and structures is a powerful feature of human cognition, allowing us to reason about structures and relationships. A marriage, for example, is a concrete event, or a structure for organizing our social knowledge, or a profound set of constraints on future behavior. Structural inference for generalized learning. It is possible then for the futures to be inferred or generalized rather than planned. By corollary, sparse observations can cause profound learning when constrained by structural knowledge. When reports of Austrian nobles crossing the Pyrenees reached Louis the 14th of France, he was able to see the same structural relation to infer a proposed alliance between the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empires. His subsequent plan to detain the bride-to-be at Versailles led to the War of the Spanish Succession. By filtering experiences through a scaffold of relational knowledge, precise inferences can be drawn from little data. If structures and relations are represented explicitly, however, there is potential for inference at dramatic levels of abstraction. The social experiments of watching a parent cajoling a child to new bravery, for example, can be replicated even when people or animals are replicated with abstract shapes. The dynamic relationship between two triangles on the screen is sufficient for us to infer the roles of parents and child and the motives of emotions of each. As with the non-spatial grid cells described earlier, a structure that is evolved or learned to describe the behavior in one setting can be generalized to a completely different domain. Whilst it might seem initially mysterious why there's evolutionary benefit to infer social dynamics between triangles or two dimensionals of birds, it is clear that the ability to infer structural analogies between disparate situations has profound consequences for learning. Getting saved by a bicycle helmet might, for example, make you more likely to wear a safety jacket next time you are on a boat, or to take out home insurance next time that you are at your computer. In modern artificial intelligence research, there is substantial effort to discover learning rules that ensure continual learning. This is learning rules that enable new tasks to be learned by networks without destroying old ones. In our view, structural abstractions and inferences are a key element to this endeavor. It takes a particular dramatic form of selective attention to be a cognitive neuroscience test. When a subject walks into the laboratory, reads a complex set of instructions, and effortlessly translates them into complex sequence of future events and actions to be performed inside a 13-tone sarcophagus that they happily enter because the stranger has told them that it's safe, it takes an unusual degree of restraint to choose to study neural activity when the same subject receives payments that differ by 15 pence. When animals in the wild are capable of building sophisticated networks for burrows, for example, or allegiances, it takes a similar degree of focus to choose to study how they navigate an open 1 meter square, or whether they prefer one stimulus to another. After several months of training, the selective attention has, however, been profitable because it has allowed experiments to be performed in a theoretical framework where they can build on one another in a formal sense. We envision that the nascent emergence of formalisms that describe more complex, flexible behaviors will similarly provide a framework for profitable experiments in this broader behavioral sphere and further encourage the exciting reemergence of collaborations between protagonists of artificial and biological intelligence. An added bonus that this already very long article has a list of key terms and explanations. Surprise, surprise. Lucky us. So clarifying the terminology. States of the world. A state is a possible configuration of the world, whilst the true statement of the world is complex and highly dimensional. Only a very small part of the state is relevant to the animal performing a task. The animal therefore has a state definition problem. If they can give different names to the states in which these relevant dimensions are different, but the same names to states which only differ in irrelevant dimensions, they will dramatically reduce the learning problem. Whichever learning algorithm they employ, for example, a waiter learning efficient strategies for opening wine bottles should have separate states for corks versus screw tops, but not for red versus white contents. This way, they will learn fastest because with two states rather than one, they will be able to learn the two different strategies. And for two states rather than four, they will twice as much experience on each strategy. Latent states. Problems arise when these relevant dimensions are not observable. Whilst waiters can often see the tops of their wine bottles, there's little immediate sensory data to tell a driver whether they can or cannot use the bus route. One solution to the problem is for the driver to build different latent states that allow different routes to be planned during commuting and non-commuting times. Models of the world. A model of the world is an internal representation of the world structure that can be used to predict future states of the world. A good model encompasses a parsimonious state definition, but also an understanding of how each state transitions to the next. This is usually expressed as PS of S and A, the probability that each state will transition to each other if you choose action A. If you have such a model, you can clearly plan your future, but you can also learn more efficiently as the model places strong constraints on possible explanations for sensory data. If the cake is burnt, it is unlikely to be due to the extra spoonful of sugar. Learning set describes an accrued knowledge from prior tasks that allows for a stereotype learning of new tasks. If an animal arrives in a new task equipped for a prior task with a model of the task, or even with parsimonious state representations, they will learn the new task much faster. In Harlow's example, this learning set came from prior experience of the exact same task, but it's clear that knowledge can be generalized across different tasks that share features. Faced with a screwdriver, it is likely advantageous to have learned to open a bottle. Meta-learning is the machine learning term for a learning set, whereby features that are common among many tasks are exploited to speed up learning of particular task instance. There are a number of approaches to meta-learning. One example is meta-reinforcement learning, in which meta-learning is driven by reward prediction errors. More general forms of meta-learning might also be driven by sensory observations. In machine learning, meta-learning can be used to tune synaptic weights, but also to tune neural architectures, resulting in interesting parallels with learning over the lifespan and adaptation over evolutionary timescales, respectively. Factorized representations. The learning set separating the structural representations from the representation sensory particularities of the task facilitate reusing the structural representation in related tasks. Factorizing is one way to achieve this separation. Here, the probability distribution in the task is a product of the two independent distributions describing the modal structure and sensory contributions. Having learned both component distributions, flexible generalizations can be made to entirely new task conjunctions, for example, a different arrangement of sensory events. Such representations are reminiscent of the separation of structural from sensory information in the cortices surrounding the hippocampus and are consistent with the reuse of structural information across different rooms and remapping experiments in the medial entorhinal cortex, but not the hippocampus. Basic representations. If learning sets can act across different tasks, then the representation of the model cannot be a hard-coded state diagram. It must be flexible such that the new task can be constructed from a combination of elements of old tasks. They are termed bases and should represent common features of task in a manner that allow flexible recombination. This broad definition encompasses bases for how features should be combined into state definitions, but also bases for common patterns of transitional structure in the world, and for how state features impact upon this transition structure. These last two types of bases appear to have commonalities with entorhinal cell populations. Eigenvector basis. One important basis representation is the eigenvector basis, and is the linear basis that explains the most variance in the data per basis function, and is therefore a particularly efficient way to represent the structure of a task. An interesting recent observation is that the eigenvectors of the transition function of 2D space have strong similarities to grid cells. Structural inference. When encountering new tasks, animals should infer what structural knowledge they should use to guide their decisions. They can do this either by inferring structure by observed sensory features, or inferring structure from observed transitions, or by combination. In reinforcement learning, the inferred structure can be used to define the possible state spaces and constrain the possibilities or relations between different states while learning the state space of the new task. In this paper, we suggest that having explicit representation of a structure can help in solving such inference problems, therefore learning new state spaces. Okay, so much props to the authors of this paper, and I'm going to also do the paper on mental labor. I lost most of my audience, and it's very difficult. Hopefully this will come to be useful to other people. So I'm just going to delete these because I read through them, and I'll put these in the description when I'm done. And I'm going to go back, to the chess studies, but I'm glad to just have these words leave my mouth and have a better understanding out there. And you see, like this paper saying how the mind works, these different forms of knowledge coming together. Like I said, Gobet, I'm going to talk about his research on expertise, maybe Erickson, and formulate multiple truth hypotheses as a mental technique that could actually help your average person accomplish more mentally complicated things. Okay, so let's look at this last paper I'm going to do today, Mental Labor. Poole and Botvinnik again, similar names, and the year on this. It's 2018 from Nature Human Behavior journal. This one also has a lot of good diagrams. And here we're going to talk about like the chunking theory, and the expertise is that you get better when you do effort, like working out. You get stronger when you try to push yourself past the limit. When you don't push yourself past the limit, it has much limited benefit. And so mentally also, a person improves understanding of something when a person exerts their effort to think about something that is slightly beyond their comfort level. And, so let's look at one of the best studies, and I have more, and this is a topic we're going to go much more into. And hopefully you see, how these machine learning algorithms, the most recent understandings of the brain and psychology are coming together, and, what Duvet is going to be trying to do with the multiple truth hypothesis. Mental labor. Mental effort is an elementary notion in folk psychology and familiar figure in everyday introspective experience. However, as an object of scientific study, mental effort has remained rather elusive. Cognitive psychology has provided some tools for understanding how effort impacts performance by linking the effort with cognitive control function. What has remained less clear are the principles that govern the allocation of mental effort. Under what circumstances do people choose to invest mental effort, and when do they decline to do so? And what regulates the intensity of mental effort when it is applied? In new and promising work, these questions are being approached with the tools of behavioral economics. Though still in its infancy, the economic approach to mental effort research has already uncovered important aspects of effort-based decision-making and points clearly to the future lines of inquiry, including some intriguing opportunities presented by recent artificial intelligence research. If one listens carefully to the way people talk about mental effort in everyday life, it is striking how often mental effort is tied to terminology from economics. We invest effort in the hope that the payoff may be worth it. We exhort to pay attention. We labor over a decision. Our children work hard in their schoolwork, hopefully not finding it too mentally taxing. Workers at IBM were for many years surrounded by signs reminding them that their job was to think. We don't get paid for working with our feet, declared their company's founder. We get paid for working with our heads. To judge from some locutions, it appears that we associate mental effort with notions of exchange and labor. In short, we think of mental effort in economic terms. In scientific research on mental labor, there has been growing trend towards taking this connection seriously, analyzing mental effort from economic point of view, and applying formal tools from behavioral economics and labor economics to understand its operation. Even though this approach is relatively new, it has already revealed a number of key features for effort-based decision-making. To underscore this potential, this review traces the development of this trend, surveys its latest products, and considers its future prospects. Economics of mental effort. In scientific context, mental effort has been defined as subjective intensification of mental energy, which mediates between how well an organism can potentially perform on some task and how well it might actually perform on the task. For both a psychological and economic perspective, the question that naturally arises from this definition is, what are the factors that determine the intensity of mental activity that is selected? As we shall review, research pursuing this question has started from two key notions. First, in standard economic fashion, it has been assumed that the allocation of mental effort is rational, that is, people use mental effort to increase payoffs, or in formal economic terms, to maximizing subjective utility. Second, it has been considered that mental effort is associated with negative utility, that is, such effort is costly. Putting these two notions together, the resulting challenge has been to understand mental effort allocation in terms of a cost-benefit analysis which weighs the potential payoffs of mental effort against its inherent cost. The economic perspective on mental effort was a natural extension of early behaviorist work, which propounded a law of less work. This stated that if two or more behavioral sequences, each involving a different amount of energy consumption or work, have been equally well reinforced an equal number of times, the organism will gradually learn to choose the less laborious behavioral sequence, leading to attainment of the reinforcing state of affairs. Though not phrased in explicitly economic terms, the economic flavor of the proposal is obvious, and subsequent research has cashed out the law of less work in explicit economic terms by mapping it to formalisms from economic labor supply theory. The law of less work was originally intended to address physical rather than mental effort. However, the notion of effort minimization soon began to pop up in research on cognitive and decision-making. Social psychology, Alport explained that racial prejudices in these terms, writing, "We like to solve problems easy. Why? Well, it takes less effort, and effort, except in the area of our most intense interest, is disagreeable." Similar in discussing the process of politically messaging, McGuire characterized human beings as lazy organisms seeking to spend as little as mental energy as possible. Meanwhile, in cognitive psychology, Brody and Ginsburg explained strategy, choices, and arithmetic by appealing to a drive for cognitive economy. Summing up the point of view, Taylor influentially described human decision makers as cognitive misers. In most early work on these lines, the notion of cost-benefit trade-off and mental effort was treated informally. However, a pioneering paper on the economy of the human processing system went further, importing the notion of a utility function, summing the positive utility derived from the task performance with the negative utility associated with the mental effort itself. Conversely, economics started turning towards psychology, eventually broaching the role of mental effort in decision-making. For example, the economists Smith and Walker introduced a labor theory of economic choice, which featured a term captured from the disunity of cognitive effort and the disutility of cognitive effort, and Cameron and Hogarth put forth a closely related capital labor production framework, emphasizing the dependence of effort demands on cognitive ability. The latter paper offered a frank expression of the motivating intuition. Economics instinctively assume thinking is a costly activity. Mental effort is like a physical effort. People dislike both. In A, you have the low demand queue, 10% task switching, and the high demand queue, 90% task switching. So the demand selection task on each trial, the participant selects between two visual stimuli. The stimulus reveals a number, which is classified by one or two rules depending on its color. One stimulus yields numbers that tend to repeat the last encountered color, requiring frequent effortless task switching. The others yield numbers that do tend to repeat the last encoding color, demanding less effort. Typically, choice behavior from the demand selection task showing a tendency to disproportionately choose the low demand option, as predicted by the labor economic cost benefit perspective. The error bars indicate. So I'm encourage people to read through this whole paper on their own, but it also has nice graphics. Evidence from an intrinsic effort cost. An important limitation attaining to all the work noted so far is that it leveraged the notion of effort cost as an explanatory principle rather than a hypothesis to be integrated directly. A first step towards overcoming this limitation was made using a task in which participants chose repeatedly between two visual stimuli. When selected, each stimulus produced a series of numbers which, depending on the color they were presented in, demanded either a magnitude or priority judgment. The key to the task was that one choice stimulus yielded numbers that required frequent switches between the two classification tasks, while the other yielded numbers that required less frequent switching, low demand. Across a series of experiments, participants consistently gravitated toward the low demand option. This bias was universal across participants, could not be fully explained in terms of error avoidance or minimization of time on task, and was reduced when a monetary incentive was linked with the high effort choice, confirming its sensitivity to motivational factors. Closely related work provided similar validation of the notion of cognitive effort cost using tasks in which participants choose between performing low effort working memory tasks for a small monetary reward or high effort working memory tasks for a larger reward. After each choice, an adaptive adjustment algorithm changes the offer for the low effort option until an indifference point between the two options is identified. Across several studies, this indifference point has been found to link the high effort option with a higher reward than the low effort option. The surplus amount associated with the high reward task can be viewed as quantifying the cost of mental effort. A number of subsequent studies have adopted similar paradigms to further probe the cost of effort. For example, evidence was provided that cognitive and physical effort are associated with different cost functions. It was shown that effort costs are linked to metacognitive monitoring functions rather than to inherent task demands. These and other studies have helped to clarify which particular kinds of mental activities are associated with effort cost. While effort avoidance has been observed across a fairly wide range of task manipulations, the common ingredient appears to be the engagement of top-down cognitive control, possibly linked with engagement of the brain's executive or multiple demand network. This is not surprising given the long-standing idea that subjective mental effort is linked with the mobilization of cognitive control functions. Mental effort and the utility function. The utility function is a critical construct in economics. Here, a real number is attached to each number, a set of goods or situations, indicating its economic value or utility. The economic approach to cognitive effort has generally modeled the cost of effort by factoring it into the utility function in some manner. In practice, this has been taken three broad forms, which further qualitative distinctions within each category. In the simplest models, it is assumed that the negative utility of effort combines with the positive utility of payoffs in a purely additive manner. This is implicit in models that define a function relating to the intensity of effort to a single cost. In some such models, it is assumed that the relationship is linear, so that each additional unit of effort adds a fixed amount of this utility to the cost. Other work has considered that the form of the function might be convex, so that successive increments in effort instantaneously lead to greater increases in the cost of effort. Finally, the relationship between effort and its cost could be concave, so that the cost is relatively sensitive to increases in effort when it is low, but not when it is high. From a behavioral economic standpoint, this form most closely relates to the idea of diminishing returns, with each additional increase in effort leading to smaller increases in cost. Second class of models posits a more complex, non-additive relationship between reward and effort cost, but assumes that the impact of effort on reward is nonetheless uniform across reward magnitudes. This form of model takes inspiration from work on temporal discounting, where rewards are decremented by delay and essentially substituted effort for time. For example, this relationship would take the form of exponential discounting function, where the effect of additional effort is more comparably across existing levels of effort because of its constant decay rate. Alternatively, it could take the form of a hyperbolic discounting function, predicting instead that additional effort more strongly affects the utility of a reward at lower effort demands compared with higher effort demands. The third class of utility function considers that the effect of effort on utility may depend on both the level of effort and the level of reward, and may assume different functional forms depending on each of these. Inspirations in the case has been drawn from economic labor supply theory, and following the convention in the field, effort is usually plotted in terms of its conceptual inverse, leisure, and payoffs in terms of cumulative income. Utility then shows up in the third dimension, making the utility function a surface. Note that in the example, the iso-utility contours plotted in the panel are concave towards the origin, but they can take many different forms, yielding different behavioral effects, as discussed in the main text. It is important to realize that concurrent research in the effort-based decision-making has not determined which of these functional forms most accurately describes human behavior. Future lines of research should aim to distinguish between them and establish functional links between these three different categories of parameterization with relationship between effort and value. Here's the picture of the three different model classes. A, several functions linking the intensity of effort to its subjective cost. The green line shows a concave from where each unit of effort incurs less cost. The red line shows a convex form where cost increase with effort, and the black line shows a linear form where there is a fixed cost per unit of effort. In all cases, effort costs are simply added to rewards to compute net value or utility. B, effort discounting functions mapping effort to net value. The blue line shows a hyperbolic discounting function where increases in effort more strongly affect rewards when effort is low compared with when it is high. The purple line shows an exponential discounting function where increases in effort affect rewards similarly across baseline efforts. And C, a joint reward effort utility function mapping levels of effort and reward to a net value. Here, the ISO utility contours are drawn concave, but these can also take other forms. Note the color of the bar on the right refers only to C. Okay. Shape of the effort cost function. With the notion of cost and of effort now directly validated, several studies have aimed to characterize the shape of the underlying utility function, asking how subjective cost of effort scales as the intensity of effort itself increases. Much of the previous work on behavioral economics had asked how the subjective utility of monetary reward scales with increasing monetary value. While the simple linear model of the cost function has proven adequate to model some behavioral phenomenon, other work points to a nonlinear function. For example, it had been found that people are risk adverse to effort, preferring predictable amounts of effort over risky prospects. Applying a standard behavioral economic analysis to this finding suggests the cost function for effort should be convex, with successive increments in carrying out larger and larger costs. Seeming to contradict this conclusion, a recent study compared several candidate functions and found the data were best described by a concave hyperbolic cost function. Further research will be needed to resolve this apparent discrepancy, and also perhaps to explain how hyperbolic discounting might account for decisions to forego both effort and payoff entirely, given that such a discount can never completely erase the value of a prospective payoff. In the meantime, the prevailing uncertainty provides an opportunity to note that some inherent difficulties associated with inferring the cost function for mental effort from choice behavior alone. Crucially, doing so requires the possibility of quantifying effort in terms of some fixed unit. This is inherently difficult, since effort is not a property of a target task alone, but also a function of the individual's cognitive capacities, as well as the degree of effort voluntarily mobilized for the task. which in turn is a function of the individual's reward sensitivity. These factors can be difficult to disentangle through behavioral observations, the problem which might aptly be called the econometric problem in mental effort research. Most coherent results have been obtained not by investigating the cost of effort per se, but rather the overall shape of the net utility function that summarizes the effort reward trade-off. Economic labor supply theory has been used to evaluate this. This branch of economics addresses the question of how workers allocate their time between work and leisure, and in particular how this is influenced by hourly wages. The founding assumption of labor supply theory is that workers weigh the value of monetary income against the value of leisure, essentially the inverse of the cost of work or effort. Any particular combination of income and leisure time translates to a single utility, and the space of all income-leisure pairings is spanned by utility surface is illustrated. Central tenet of labor supply theory is that utility surface is concave, curved towards the origin and billowing upward as shown in the figure. Although this may sound merely like a technical point, the concavity of a utility function has important consequences for choice behavior. Most fundamentally, it means that a worker given an available wage and the choice of how many hours to work will always favor a balance between income and leisure time. At a finer grain, the concave shapes affects the way that work hours shift in response to increases or decreases in the available wage. In particular, it means that such shifts will depend critically on how many hours are already dedicated to work versus leisure at a baseline, and how much income is already being received. Important non-concave utility functions predict very different effects. In particular, convex or planar utility function would cause workers to always allocate their time entirely to either work or leisure, rather than seeking a mixture of the two that shifts smoothly as wages change. And still other utility services studied in economics under the heading of perfect complementarity predict complete insensitivity to wage changes. Evidence has been provided that mental effort-based decisions making more cohere with the laws of labor supply theory. The concave shape of the labor supply theory utility function strongly predicts that a particular form of wage increases, termed or income compensated increases will trigger increase in work, while an income compensated wage reduction will trigger reductions in work. What makes these predictions non-trivial is that given the detailed structure of the wage changes, it is possible for decision makers to work at the same level after the wage changes as they did before and attain exactly the same level of income. The prediction from labor supply theory stipulates that workers will forego this opportunity. The prediction has been successfully tested in studies of labor markets, provided empirical validation of labor supply theory, as well as animal conditioning experiments looking at physical effort allocation. The same experimental approach was applied to mental effort-based decision-making. Participants were offered a wage for every minute spent on a cognitively demanding task during a 30-minute test period, when the remainder of the period spent on an unremunerated low-demand task. Income compensated wage changes induce shifts in effort allocations precisely as predicted by labor supply theory. These results suggested that the central features of labor supply theory, designed originally to account for economic labor markets, may also apply to mental effort. Specifically, that implied that people weigh the income derived from mental effort against the value of mental leisure in a nonlinear fashion, resulting in the preference for balanced combinations of the two. At a finer grain, the result means that the marginal cost of mental effort is radically baseline dependent. The cost of effort relative to the reward changes depending on how much effort is already being invested and how much income is already being received. Rewards of mental labor. In other research, economic tools have been leveraged to investigate a range of further issues relating to mental effort. For example, the effort discounting paradigm has been ported to rodents, demonstrating a trade-off between cognitive effort and reward in rats. Interestingly, rats show stable individual differences in effort sensitivity. This has also been observed in humans, with effort avoidance and incentive effects on effort correlating with some other cognitive and personality traits. Group level differences have been reported as well, based both on age and psychiatric status. One intriguing issue that arises from the individual difference perspective is that mental effort can, alongside with inherent cost, also carry rewards. For example, in the case of learned industriousness, people are proposed to learn a value for the exertion of effort through years of living in a world where effort often yields rewards. Moreover, the subjective value of earned rewards can sometimes increase when they're obtained through effort, perhaps reflecting a drive to resolve cognitive dissonance by justifying the investment of effort. An outstanding question is whether these effects reflect an endowment of effort with intrinsic positive value, which effectively cancels some of the inherent cost of the effort, or whether they simply reflect the value that is attached to the extrinsic products of the effort. Resolving the question deserves to be a central objective of future research, and the economic framework appears to offer a useful set for accomplishing this. As I quote in Perkyovos, the ethics of the sages love work, that what you want to do to have a successful life is to love work. That will, and in the translation of this, love effort. That you want to have a successful life, love effort. Strategy selection. One particularly interesting recent trend in research on effort-based decision-making has involved a focus of strategy selection. It has been a long-standing proposal that people select cognitive strategies through a cost-benefit analysis that takes account of effort costs. Recent works has made progress towards verifying this hypothesis by leveraging computationally explicit models of competing strategies. Particularly relevant to the present reviews are cases where strategy choice trade off against economic incentives. A vivid example of this is provided in a recent study. The focus in this work was on the decision between two strategies for rewarding based decision making, one based on habit and the other based on more effortful search through possible outcome scenarios. In reinforcement learning theories, the distinction has been mapped to a model-free system that simply reinforces actions that have led to reward, and a model-based system that plans over an internal model of the environment towards goals. A key question is how decision makers choose between the two choice mechanisms. The economic perspective on cognitive effort suggests that this arbitration may be the result of cost-benefit decision weighing the increasing accuracy of model-based planning against its effort. You notice that none of these articles mention free will, which is pretty relevant. The question here, is this saying you don't need free will because it's just a utility function that the brain carries out automatically, and decision making is not actually real? But I'll talk about that later. But here you see this diagram of the labor supply theory, and minimization could be a energy balance. Talk with Church of Entropy between income and leisure. Labor supply theory, mental effort. Top, a concave utility surface attaching a numeric value to every pairing of income and leisure time. Shown in black is iso-utility or inference contours marking out income-leisure pairings with identical utilities. Bottom, a contour map projected from the inference curves above. The diagonal line marks out a budget constraint covering the range of income-leisure combinations open to a worker facing T available hours and wage W. The gray rectangle above projects the time constraint line back up through the three-dimensional utility surface where the intersection forms an arc in both top and bottom plots. The red marker highlights the income-leisure combinations with the highest utility in the feasible set. So, Duvit's ultimate equations might even be an infinite set. Like this is just a graphical representation, but of all of the factors, it might, relatively be an infinite set, and, need Church of Entropy's help with that. Left, an income compensated wage reduction. The initial baseline wages together with the total available time T defines the initial budget constraint line in blue. The worker chooses the point along the line that maximizes utility. The blue point with associated indifference curve shown in gray. Wage reduction results in more horizontal budget constraint. The diagonal red line, however, comes along with compensating unearned income vertical red line, which causes the new budget constraint to intersect the income-leisure combination originally chosen, the blue point. Although this combination is thus still available after the wage change, note that the worker also has access to a higher utility combination which pairs increased leisure with reduced income. It's the red point with the associated iso-utility curve. Right, an income compensated wage increase shown at the same fashion. Here, the initial unearned income, the vertical blue line, plus an initial wage together define a budget constraint, the diagonal blue line. When the wage is raised, the unearned income is reduced such that the original chosen income-leisure combination is still available. However, the worker now has access to high utility combination involving less leisure and greater income. Let's see. C. Experimental results formatted to parallel the plots. And B. Impact of an income compensated wage reduction on time dedicated to cognitively easy tasks as opposed to cognitively demanding tasks that yielded a wage denominated in pieces of candy per trial. The right to the impact of income compensated wage increase. Okay. Study providing the first evidence of this relied on a variant of the so-called two-step behavioral paradigm designed to disentangle model-free from model-based choice. Versions of this task have been used to show the model-based control decreases under cognitive load, is related to cognitive control capacity, and is reliant on the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, hallmark of the kind of computationally expensive mental labor that has been identified as costly. The study tested the cost-benefit model by predicting that behavior on this would show more model-based control when higher rewards are at stake. This pattern was indeed clearly evident in the observed behavioral. As a control, the experiment was repeated, but this time using a version of the task which application of the model-based control does not yield a benefit in terms of reward. In this setting, the stakes manipulation did not yield a difference in behavior, consistent with the interpretation that decision makers engage in effortful model-based control only when the prospective payoffs offset the attendant effort cost. In a set of complementary studies, the other side of this trade-off was investigated by manipulating the effort cost of model-based control through the required depth of planning while keeping the prospective payoffs constant. Consistent with the cost function benefit, they found that model-based control was reduced in the face of a deeper, more complex causal structure. Taken together, these results are consistent with the idea that arbitration between these reinforcement learning strategies is guided by an economic cost-benefit analysis. Alongside behavioral studies like these, a growing number of experiments with both humans and animals have applied neuroeconomic techniques to elucidate the neural underpinnings of effort-based decision-making. Although such neuroscientific research falls outside the scope of this review, it is worth noting that the idea of cost-benefit analysis has become increasingly central in such work, being formalized, for example, in the proposal that prefrontal circuits maximize the expected value of control, a quantity that takes effort cost into account. This and other neuroscience work on mental effort has been surveyed in a number of recent publications. Why is mental labor costly? As the existence of a cost of mental labor effort has become increasingly well validated and its properties increasingly probed, attention has been increasingly paid to an overarching question: why should mental effort be costly? On first glance, this cost seems to perverse, since, at least according to our folk psychological notions, effort typically yields positive outcomes. The resulting riddle has not been fully solved. However, here again, an economic perspective has been applied. The general approach is to consider that effort may draw, in some sense, on a scarce resource. Cost then can be understood as serving to protect or conserve this resource. An early hypothesis was that, like physical effort, mental effort might raise metabolic energy consumption. This idea was motivated by a behavioral depletion effect in which effort was withdrawn after bouts of effort exertion. According to influential theory, this effort was proposed to reflect a depletion of blood glucose. However, the glucose hypothesis is not held up, and the existence of behavioral depletion has itself been called into question. There do appear to exist real-time on-task effects on effort which interact with incentives. However, these appear to be better explained by motivational variables than by metabolic depletion. A more tenable idea is that mental effort's costs are linked to a limited resource that is cognition or computational in nature. Rather than metabolic. In some work, this resource has been characterized broadly in terms of computational informational processing, and indeed human decision makers do display a tendency to select information processing strategies or algorithms that minimize computational demands. Computational inherently demands time, and another related perspective on effort cost is that they are tied to time through opportunity cost, the rewards associated with foregone activities. Another form of opportunity cost derives from the exploitation dilemma, the inherent trade-off between exploiting established knowledge and exploring the environment so as to gain new knowledge. It has been proposed that effort avoidance may reflect an adaptive bias that triggers disengagement from exploited cognitive tasks to encourage exploration. Another non-incompatible perspective ties the limited cognitive resource more specifically to cognitive control. Control functions have long been understood as a bottleneck in cognitive information processing, providing potential explanation for why subjective costs appear to be specifically linked with the allocation. Indeed, a number of cognitive model enterprises have explicitly incorporated a principle of minimal control or least effort, again referring to cognitive control. However, having covered these points, it's worth noting that on close inspection, the idea of limited resources is not quite sufficient to explain the existence of mental effort cost. In principle, a rational allocation strategy should be able to make the most of such a limited resource without the need for an inherent cost. To address this issue, was suggested that the cost of mental effort might serve as a heuristic wired in by evolution, which discourages the wasteful allocation of cognitive control without requiring detailed allocation decisions that might themselves be computationally intensive. Another more novel possibility could be advanced on recent artificial intelligence research leveraging deep reinforcement learning, multitask learning, and neural network architecture that learn both a generic default stimulus response policy and a set of task-specific policies has been investigated. Crucially, during learning, the default policy was updated by distilling the collection of task-specific policies, absorbing their common features into the default policy, while the task-specific policies were shaped by a cost term that penalizes them from departing from the default policy. The rationale for this setup was that it would encourage the emergence of a maximally useful default policy, and simulation results showed that the learning architecture displayed greater stability and reliability than architectures without the relevant features. Although this work was not addressed to human psychology, it gives rise to an intriguing new idea concerning the cost of mental effort by analogy to standard cognitive models of automatic versus controlled behavior. The default policy and the recently reported architecture can be thought as an important implementing a set of automatic or habitual behaviors, and the task-specific policies a set of controlled behaviors, which override the automatic behaviors when appropriate. From this point of view, the simulation results suggest that it may be beneficial to attach a cost to top-down cognition control, specifically because it encourages the development of optimal habits, resulting in a system that relies on control as little as possible and that displays reliable, stable learning in multitask environments. In conclusion, the economic perspective on mental effort has had a decidedly beneficial impact on psychological research. It has stimulated the development of important new tools, which are now being exploited to shed new light on many aspects of mental effort-based decision-making. At the same time, it has revealed novel questions that might not otherwise have been considered and has suggested new theoretical perspectives. It seems like the economic approach to mental effort will remain a productive continuing to provide leverage on important issues. At the same time, recent work suggests that the economic approach may benefit from ideas stemming from other fields, and in particular ideas from reinforcement learning theory and optimal control. In this regard, the recent explosion in research on artificial intelligence may provide useful ideas. Okay, so let's look at these diagrams that I skipped. I'm about to call it a day. So thanks to the 5 people still turning in. T, China. Okay. So evidence for individual differences, correlation, effort-based decision-making. Positive correlation was found between the degree of temporal discounting and the effort and mental effort cost as assessed by the COG-ED paradigm, with effort discounting quantified using an area under the curve measurement. This correlation indicates that people with more impulsivity in an intemporal choice paradigm showed increased mental effort cost on the COG-ED paradigm. The solid line indicates the linear relationship, and the shaded area indicates the 95% confidence interval. Behavioral results reveal the relationship between negative symptoms and schizophrenia, quantified by the brief negative symptom scale, evolution scale, and the COG-ED area under the curve measured by effort cost. The results suggested that motivational deficits typically observed in schizophrenia are related to increased effort discounting. The dashed line indicates the linear relationship. And then you C through F. Effort operationalized at the speed at which participants were able to switch between two cognitive tasks. To assess participants' cost-benefit trade-off, they manipulated the monetary incentive accuracy performance from block to block. They found the increased incentive enhanced effort mainly for participants who scored relatively low on a need for cognition scale, which measures the inclination to engage in demanding cognitive activity in early life, in everyday life. They also found that participants low in cognitive control capacity, as measured by the Stoop paradigm, displayed a larger incentive effect, presumably because for them, larger rewards are needed to offset their increased effort cost. So the solid lines indicate the linear relationship, and the shaded areas indicate the standard error. Transition structures, trial event sequences, and results from multi-stage decision-making tasks. Two-step task. Each round of the task begins in one of two first stages, each of which offers a choice between two brightly colored spaceships. Choice of a spaceship triggers a transition, as shown in the figure. The two second stage states identified by different aliens. The second stage state each yield a monetary reward with independent probabilities that change randomly but slowly across trials to encourage continuous learning. The task distinguishes model-free from model-based control by exploiting the model-based system's knowledge about the equivalence of first stage states. Model-based decision makers are able to transfer experiences from the first stage state to the other. Model-free learners cannot do this since by definition they rely solely on directly experienced action reward associations. For example, after a surprisingly large reward on the previous trial, a pure model-based learner will be more inclined to revisit the second stage state, even if the first stage state in the current trial is not the same as in the previous trial. A model-free learner is unable to make this inference because it does not assess actions in terms of the consequences. That's an A. So it would be to test the effect of increased incentive model-based control. Stakes manipulation was implemented in the two-task step. Each trial began with a cue that indicated whether the point on that trial would be multiplied by 1 or 5. On the high-stakes trial shown here, the total points earned were 25 times 4. Model-based choice is component for the low and high-stake conditions in experiment 1 and 2. The choice component measured the influence of model-based decision-making, quantifying this as the increase in probability of choosing the same goal as the previous trial after positive prediction errors than after negative prediction errors. Prediction errors were estimated using a reinforcement learning model. In experiment 1, where model-based control yielded higher reward, increased stakes triggered a stronger reliance on model-based control. Experiment 2, the task was designed such a model-based control yielded no monetary benefit. In this setting, no effect of states was observed. Seen here in C. And then to test the effect of planning demands on model-based control, a novel multi-stage decision-making task was developed. At the start of each trial, the effort condition was randomly selected. On low-effort trials, participants made a single choice between 3 spaceships that then transitioned to one of the 3 planets. Note that these trials were analogous to the two-step depiction in the first, with the exception of an additional planet. High-effort trials first required a choice between 2 randomly selected space stations and then transitioned to a pair of spaceships. These spaceships then transitioned to the same final stage states as the low-effort trials. At the start of each trial, empty containers indicate whether the following trial would be either low 3 containers or high-effort 2 containers trial. A reduction in model-based control in the face of more complex planning structure was observed, comparing the start of the high-effort trials to the start of the low-effort trials in the middle stage of the high-effort trial. Error bars indicate plus minus within the subjects, and asterisks indicate statistically significant difference derived from tests. Fascinating. Okay, and Schematic of the proposed multitask learning environment. A, you have habitualize, penalize for the various policies. You have stimuli, features, and responses, and control representations. Schematic of the proposed multitask learning model A. The system, which takes the form of a multi-part neural network not shown, learns several policies or ways of responding to a perceptual input. These include a default policy, symbolized by pi o, and a set of task-specific policies 1 through 4. The system is trained on a set of different tasks as in interleaved fashion. During this process, the default policy is updated so as to capture elements that the task-specific policies have in common. In the terminology of machine learning, this is a distillation of the task-specific policies and the default policy. In more cognitive terms, it is akin to habitualizing the most common feature of the task-specific policies. Meanwhile, the task-specific policies are shaped by a penalty that is imposed when they recommend actions that differ from the actions recommended by policy 0 in the original policy and default policy. In intuitive terms, the learning process biases the systems to rely on its habits as much as possible, consistent with the psychological notion of control costs. That sticking with the default requires the least exertion of energy. There's a direct and intriguing parallel with psychological negatives of cognitive control. The features of a set of connections between perceptual inputs and action outputs on their own these define a set of automatic or habitual behaviors. However, the systems also include control representations which bias or modulate processing in the habit pathway, allowing habits to be overridden in favor of non-routine responses. By analogy to the proposed architecture, the habit pathway implements the default policy while control inputs give rise to task-specific policies. The penalty term translates in this context into a cost top-down cognitive control. Okay, so that's all the papers I'm going to read today. Hope people enjoy the stream, gain from it. People who watch it later gain from it also. No singing today. We're just going to be trying to improve our minds and do these studies and talk about interdisciplinary mind. And, I'm going to be doing some more chess studies. I'm going to review, Gobet, probably a whole series of his literature. I'm going to go back to physics and the holographic universe and the multiple universe theory. I have more stuff on that, but I wanted to cover this stuff. You just say the holographic universe after the science of how the mind actually operates. Maybe the holographic universe is going to make more sense, and there's a lot more information. You look at Gobet. Is there a way to generalize expertise? Can you generally say I'm a mental expert and good at all tasks, like IQ, general intelligence? Is that from mental effort? Is it from birth? From genetics, and I'm going to cover more about that in relation mostly to chess studies, and also simply trying to combine as many fields as possible. The multiple truth hypothesis was basically a self-created mental technique that I myself created because I wanted to understand complex things. That Duvid himself was trying to understand extremely complex ideas, and I needed a mental technique to do it. You just pray that God makes me smarter. And so I came on to these chess studies about template theory and ideas of expertise, and I believe I've came up with something unique and new. But in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to have to give the current state of the ideas out there, and also like the chunking theory. Just me reading these articles is a process of trunking. That it's not like a scientific experiment per se, but it somewhat is, of chunking. And the cognitive processes I mentioned in some of the earlier videos about memory and the effects of memory when you read it with an internal voice in your head, when you just visually read something, if you read it with your finger, versus saying the words out loud, versus listening back in voice, and all the various methods. So hopefully this technique is going to prove valuable. Say, how is it possible that Duvid could read all these books and understand these things? Because I discovered a mental technique that I'm calling the multiple truth hypothesis, and it's based on scientific evidence. So I'm going to continue reviewing these studies. And there's a lot more very interesting things, but we're up to the current studies. I'm going to go back into some more historic studies, but I think hopefully, at least to myself, there's a little clarification in my mind. And I mean, number two, Jennifer Church of Entropy, probably took in my ideas more seriously than anybody, maybe some of the other viewers, and hopefully another few months of research, and I'll start formally putting out ideas on the multiple truth hypothesis. Maybe write a book, or I could go around talking about it. But as of now, I'm going to continue my research. I'm going to continue to read some of these papers, online video if it's useful to other people. Thank God, at the service of humanity, at your service to help make the world a better place by helping people improve our minds. So, with that, blessings. Good stream today, 2.5 hours. It's possible I'll do another one tomorrow. I got a lot of papers to read through. Hanukkah coming Friday. I'm not sure if I'm going to be going to Hanukkah events. Like COVID-19 is pretty strong right now, and so I don't know the actual protocol. None of the rabbis have reached out and asked me for my help, so I may not be streaming much IRL Hanukkah stuff this year. If that's the case, it's more likely I'll be reading more papers and streaming. So blessings, everybody, and look forward to week in review. I look forward to Jennifer making more videos related to her theory. I'm not really a writer. Eventually, I will put this in writing, and but the video form is just to make it in my head and you say to organize these thoughts, because I'm bringing in you're really a lifetime of research, all types of information from all types of fields, in just a template in my head, that I believe that there's a superstructure that could hold all these disparate ideas. That's what I'm proclaiming, and I'm proclaiming that I could teach that to other people, and that I have a systematic method that could be written out in logical steps and reproduced and even scientifically tested. So look forward to continuing on the research. So God bless everybody. Take care. Have a great day, and see you next time. Namaste, shalom.